I didn't notice the forest at first. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and fills them with its absence. The road had narrowed into a dirt path hours ago, twisting between thick clusters of pines whose needles whispered softly against one another as the wind brushed past. I parked my car at the edge where the trees pressed close, their shadows long and jagged under the fading sun. There was a smell in the air, damp and earthy, the scent of wet leaves and soil, something ancient. It made my chest tighten, not from fear, not exactly, but from the strange realization that I wasn't entirely alone here. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the cabin. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred feet, but the ground was uneven and littered with sticks and fallen branches. Each step made a soft crunch, a tiny punctuation in the forest stillness. I paused often just to listen. The wind stirred something in the distance, maybe the branches of a birch or the sway of reeds by the small stream nearby. It sounded like soft murmurs, not words, not voices, just murmurs that made the air feel heavier. The cabin appeared slowly, like it was hesitant to show itself. At first, I saw only the roof peeking above the trees, shingles weathered and darkened by years of rain. Then the walls, gray and splintered, leaning slightly as if the structure had been breathing for decades. I didn't hear any doors creak or boards groan as I approached. The silence was complete, but somehow it felt like it had its own weight. I ran my hand along the rough siding, feeling the ridges of old wood. There were scratches, faint but deliberate, on some of the boards near the doorway. Not random. I thought about that for a long moment. Someone had been here, maybe recently. The thought sent a small ripple of unease through me, and yet I was drawn forward, my curiosity stronger than my caution. The door hung slightly off its hinges. I pushed gently, and it opened with a faint squeal. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fireplace that I could see, at least not yet. Dust motes floated lazily in the slanted rays of light spilling through the single window, catching on broken floorboards and the scattered debris of long-forgotten days. I stepped in, careful, trying not to disturb the stillness. Each footstep sounded louder here than it had outside, echoing faintly against the low wooden walls. I looked around. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 15. A table, cracked and warped, sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. One chair had a leg missing, replaced with a piece of scrap wood that looked like it had been hammered in a hurry. The floor was littered with old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, some curling at the edges. I knelt to pick one up, careful not to tear it. The date was over 30 years old, but the headline caught my eye, something about a disappearance in this very area. I didn't read further. Not yet. I put it down, feeling the strange pressure of being watched, even though I could see no one. The cabin seemed to breathe around me. Not literally, of course, but the way the light shifted, the way the floor groaned under my weight, it all made me feel like I had stepped into a space that remembered every footstep that had ever crossed it. I ran my fingers over the walls, feeling grooves and dents in the wood. They weren't natural. Someone had carved into them slowly over time, leaving marks I couldn't decipher. A series of lines, some deep, some barely there, running from floor to ceiling like they were counting something, or someone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes with a soft, irregular rhythm. I turned toward it, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, though I knew the forest was empty. The trees swayed gently, their shadows stretching across the cabin floor. A crow cawed somewhere beyond the trees, distant and hollow, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I realized I had stopped breathing, holding it instinctively, listening. The forest had its own pulse, slower than mine but steady and unyielding. I wandered deeper inside, toward a corner that looked darker than the rest. There was a small stove, rusted and cold, with soot still faintly visible around the edges. Next to it, a pile of wood stacked haphazardly. Some pieces were charred, blackened at the ends. Someone had built a fire here not long ago, I was certain. Maybe someone who had wanted to be alone, or maybe someone who had wanted to be hidden. The thought made the hairs at the back of my neck rise. I explored the shelves along the wall, most of them empty, though one held a few cracked jars of preserved food. The labels had faded long ago, leaving only vague outlines of words. I picked up one jar, shaking it slightly. The contents rattled faintly, a soft, hollow sound. I put it back carefully. Everything here seemed fragile, like it had been waiting for someone to notice, but not necessarily for me. A faint draft blew from somewhere, carrying with it a hint of something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. I swallowed, trying to calm the sudden surge of anxiety that tightened my stomach. I reminded myself I was alone. There was no one else here, just the cabin, the forest, the long shadows. And yet, the scratches on the wall, the crooked chair, the burned wood, all suggested someone had been here. Someone who had left in a hurry, or perhaps had never really left at all. I walked to the single window, looking out at the forest that surrounded the cabin like a living wall. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and gnarled, branches reaching out like hands. Somewhere beyond, I thought I heard a step on dry leaves, far away, almost imperceptible. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the wind, just the forest. But the feeling remained, a weight pressing on the back of my mind, whispering that this place kept its secrets close. I turned back to the cabin interior, noticing for the first time a faint trail of footprints in the dust. They were small, maybe a child's, leading toward the back wall and stopping abruptly. I crouched to examine them. The dust was undisturbed beyond that point. Nothing. No trail leading out, no other marks. It was as if whoever had walked here had vanished into the air. I straightened slowly, feeling a chill creep over me. I found myself drawn to a corner of the cabin where the floorboards seemed newer, lighter than the rest. I knelt, running my hands over the wood. There was a slight hollow beneath one of the boards. My fingers traced the edge carefully. I pressed down lightly and the board shifted, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with fraying string. I pulled them out gently. Old letters, faded photographs, a few scribbled notes. Faces stared up at me from the photos, eyes wide, expressions frozen somewhere between fear and resignation. The handwriting on the notes was jagged, hurried, almost desperate. I didn't read everything, only glimpses. Names, dates, short sentences about being watched, about someone or something, returning. Each note made the air thicker around me, heavier in a way that made breathing slightly more difficult. I set them back carefully, as if touching them too much would awaken something sleeping in the cabin. I moved toward the door, stepping back outside. The sun had almost set, the last rays of light sliding across the forest floor, painting everything in muted oranges and deepening shadows. The air was cooler now, brushing against my skin with a damp, clammy touch. I stood still for a long moment, listening. The wind rustled the treetops, distant birds called, and for a fleeting second I thought I heard a whisper, soft and almost tender, carried on the breeze. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the cabin, just the forest. But as I turned back toward the dirt path toward my car, I felt the weight of the forest's silence follow me. The cabin sat behind me, still and patient, holding its secrets close. And I knew somehow that it remembered me now too. That night I slept in the car. The forest seemed alive even in the dark. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch felt intentional, like the woods themselves were watching, waiting. And I understood as I closed my eyes that the cabin was not just a building. It was a keeper of stories, of memories, of something unsettled. And whether I wanted it or not, I had stepped into its story. Night fell like a slow curtain, pulling the forest into deep shades of blue and black. The cabin, which had seemed merely quiet during the day, now felt different, heavier, more aware of my presence. The shadows stretched across the floorboards, lengthening in ways that made the corners of the room almost disappear. I sat on the edge of the old chair, running my fingers over its warped surface, trying to ignore the rising tension that had settled in my chest. The forest outside had gone still, or so I thought, but the quiet was no longer comforting. I heard it first as a faint creak, a single groan from the floor beneath me. I froze, listening. Then another, slower, deliberate, coming from the far end of the cabin. My mind told me it was just the wood settling, old boards adjusting to the night's cool air, but something in the rhythm of the sound made me doubt that. It was too precise, almost like a footstep, though there was no one there. I held my breath, letting the silence press against my ears until I finally exhaled. I moved toward the small table in the center of the cabin, trying to ground myself. Each step sounded louder than the last, each creak of the floor echoing through the walls. The light from my flashlight flickered slightly as I walked, painting the room in uneven strokes of shadow. I had expected to feel alone here, isolated in the forest, but now I wasn't so sure. The cabin seemed aware of me, its quiet punctuated by subtle noises that could be ignored, but never fully explained. A whisper brushed past my ears. Soft, almost a sigh, a single syllable I couldn't make out. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the walls and the ceiling, but there was nothing. No one. Just the cabin, empty and patient. I told myself it was the wind slipping through cracks or my own imagination playing tricks after hours of stillness. But the whisper came again, slightly louder this time, as if testing my attention. I could feel my pulse quicken, yet I tried to keep my breathing even, slow. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, stretching into shapes I didn't recognize. My mind filled in the gaps, and for a moment I thought I saw someone standing there, watching. But when I focused, the corner was empty. Only the dust motes floated lazily in the beam of my flashlight, undisturbed. My hands shook slightly as I lowered the light. I tried to rationalize it. Old cabins creak at night. My brain is tired. I am alone. But the feeling of being observed remained, prickling at the back of my neck. I went back to the bundle of letters and photographs I had found earlier. I spread them across the table, hoping that familiar objects would anchor me to reason. Faces stared up from the photographs, eyes frozen in fear, in hope, in resignation. The letters smelled faintly of smoke and earth, brittle with age. I ran my fingers over the edges carefully, trying not to tear them. The soft creaks continued beneath me, shifting in rhythm, almost like breathing. I didn't want to stand up, but I also didn't want to stay seated and listen to the floor groan in ways I could not explain. I decided to explore the cabin further, moving slowly toward the back corner where the floorboards had seemed newer. The small flashlight cut narrow lines of light through the darkness, bouncing across the walls and highlighting imperfections I had not noticed before. There were small scratches near the corners, faint and shallow, like claws or nails scraping gently at the surface. I paused, letting my eyes trace them. Someone had been here, maybe recently, or maybe not. The thought made me shiver, though I told myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, a soft shuffle coming from above. The cabin had no upper floor, no attic, but the sound came from somewhere I could not place. My stomach tightened. I strained my ears, listening for the source. Nothing moved in the room. The flashlight beam cut across the walls and ceiling again, searching for answers, finding only shadows and dust. I tried to calm myself, repeating silently that I was alone, that old wood settles, that my mind was playing tricks after walking the forest all day. But the whispers persisted. Now I could almost make out words, though they were garbled, broken into fragments that my brain tried to stitch together. Don't leave here, wait, watch. I could not tell if it was one voice or many, or if it was simply the wind interacting with the shape of the cabin. I swallowed hard and took a step toward the window. The forest beyond was nearly black, the trees pressing close, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. No one, nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the soft, almost imperceptible chorus of the night. I returned to the table, trying to focus on the letters again. I read one aloud softly, almost as if speaking would ground the reality around me. The words were simple, warnings scribbled with urgency. They come with the dark, one note read. Do not sleep, do not listen. I felt my pulse quicken. It was nonsense, just the ramblings of someone long gone. And yet my body responded as if the cabin itself had remembered, had heard, had recognized the warning as still true. Creaking moved closer, now beneath my feet and to my left. I froze, every nerve in my body alert. I imagined the floorboard bending, a small weight moving, nothing visible. The whispers became more distinct, almost teasing, brushing at the edge of understanding. My mind offered explanations. Wind, rodents, the subtle shifting of wood in cold air. But each time I tried to convince myself, another sound punctured the argument, a tap against the window, so soft I almost doubted I had heard it. I moved toward the window slowly, shining the light across the glass. Outside, the forest looked the same as it had in the day. Nothing moved. I leaned closer, breath fogging the glass slightly, tracing the faint outline of scratches along the frame. Marks that were not there before, I could not tell. My reflection stared back at me, eyes wide, pale in the flashlight's glow. I felt as if someone or something was reflected behind me. I spun quickly. Nothing. Only shadows. Only the quiet. Only the faint hum of something unseen, moving just beyond perception. Sitting back at the table, I tried to calm myself. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the tension ebb slightly. I pictured the forest during the day, the sun filtering through the trees, the dirt path beneath my boots. It helped for a time. But every time I opened my eyes, the cabin seemed closer, tighter, more aware of me, its air thick with unspoken memories. The whispers resumed, softer this time, curling around the edges of the room like smoke. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look around. But I could not ignore it either. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the cabin, governed by the creaks and sighs of the wood rather than any natural measure. I tried to read another letter, but the words blurred. My eyes felt heavy, my body tense with anticipation. Every small sound became a signal, every shadow a presence. I tried to convince myself to leave, to step outside, to breathe the cold night air. But the forest beyond seemed impenetrable, endless, and the cabin seemed to hold me in place, offering both safety and unease in equal measure. By the time I finally allowed myself to lie down on the old, warped chair, I understood something about the cabin I had not realized during the day. It was patient. It observed. It let you believe you were alone, that the world outside still existed. But once night fell, once shadows deepened and the light became uncertain, it whispered, it creaked. It reminded you that nothing here was truly lifeless. And though I tried to rationalize, tried to ignore it, tried to let my eyes close, I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that the cabin had already noticed me. And it was not finished. I hadn't intended to explore the cabin as thoroughly as I did that night. After hours of listening to creaks, whispers, and the soft sighing of the walls, I felt both drawn to and afraid of every corner. My flashlight's beam danced across warped wood and shadows, and for some reason, the far corner of the room called to me. There was something there I hadn't noticed during the day, a subtle unevenness in the wallboards, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. I knelt, brushing dust away from the floor. One board in particular seemed newer, smoother, as if it had been replaced. I pressed a finger along the edge and felt a slight give, like the wood was loose. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, perhaps nothing, but the thought of leaving it unexplored gnawed at me. I pressed again, this time more firmly. The board shifted slightly, and a faint, hollow sound came from within. I paused, listening. Nothing moved except my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I crouched fully, brushing the remaining dust aside, and slowly pried at the board. It swung open, revealing a narrow space behind it, a cavity large enough for a small person to stand in. My first thought was disbelief. I had walked the cabin from corner to corner, yet I had never suspected this hidden room. The air that escaped smelled older than the cabin itself, thick with dust, mold, and the faint metallic tang of rust or blood. I swallowed hard. It was dark inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting only a thin line into the gloom. I stepped cautiously, the floor groaning beneath me, each sound magnified in the confined space. The walls were rough, unfinished wood, and the ceiling pressed low so that I had to stoop slightly. And then I saw them. Items tucked away as though deliberately hidden, small personal effects, a trunk, a chair, and stacks of papers tied with string. I approached the trunk slowly, fingers trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were objects that belonged to someone who had lived with a constant, quiet obsession. There were photographs of the forest around the cabin, some taken from outside, others from within, each one capturing angles that made me feel as if the photographer had been watching someone or something without permission. I recognized the places: the creaking floorboards, the corner where I had found the loose board, the edge of the window where shadows pooled. Among the photographs were diaries, their covers cracked and worn. I opened one, and the pages smelled faintly of smoke and earth, brittle with age. The handwriting was neat but tense, curling and jagged in some places, almost trembling on the page. It began with mundane observation: the weather, small repairs, food supplies. But soon the tone shifted. There were notes about watchers, though the identity of these watchers was unclear. Sometimes it was animals, sometimes people, sometimes something that hid just beyond the edge of sight. The writer spoke of the forest as if it were alive, sentient, aware of every movement, every whisper. "They follow without sound," one entry read. "I can feel them in the corners of my eyes, just beyond the light. They watch when I sleep, when I eat, when I step outside. I am never alone." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, reading the words. It was one thing to hear whispers in the night, creaks in the floorboards, but another entirely to hold someone else's fear in your hands, someone who had been trapped here, documenting it carefully, day by day. I set the diary aside and opened another, smaller notebook, pages scribbled in a tight, frantic hand. The entries were short, almost like messages to someone unseen. "Do not trust the quiet. They hide behind everything. If you listen, they will speak." I flipped through quickly, noticing sketches in the margins, dark shapes, lines forming figures that were always just beyond recognition, blurred human forms, faces without eyes or eyes too wide. I shivered and looked around the hidden room, half expecting one of those shapes to flicker into reality. Among the papers I found small objects: buttons, keys, a broken watch, a locket with a photograph of someone smiling. Each item felt charged, like a fragment of memory or intention that had been carefully preserved. I realized then that this hidden room was more than a storage space. It was a sanctuary for obsession, a shrine to the unseen, a place where someone had lived and thought and feared with meticulous care. The air itself felt thick with remembrance, as if the room had absorbed the anxiety, the vigilance, and the loneliness of its occupant. I moved toward the far wall, brushing my fingers along the wood. There were more scratches here, deeper and more deliberate than those I had seen before. Some were vertical, some horizontal, some crisscrossing in patterns I could not decipher. The wall seemed to pulse slightly under my touch, though I knew that was impossible. I paused, listening. Somewhere in the cabin, a floorboard groaned and a whisper brushed past my ear. I turned, flashlight sweeping the hidden room, but there was nothing. Nothing except shadows, dust, and the faint, lingering weight of someone's fear. The diaries spoke repeatedly of sleep, or rather the impossibility of it. "They come closer at night," one page read. "I cannot close my eyes, I cannot rest. The dark is patient. The dark knows me." I felt a shiver run through me as I read. It was impossible not to imagine what the writer had endured night after night, with the forest and the cabin as witnesses. I pressed my hand against the wood of the wall and imagined the hours spent here, hunched over, recording observations, marking scratches, counting shadows. It was obsessive, meticulous, and lonely beyond measure. I found one last item, a small mirror, tarnished and cracked, its surface reflecting my face in a distorted, almost grotesque way. I looked into it and could barely recognize myself. The reflection seemed heavier somehow, weighted with the accumulated tension of the hidden room. I blinked and the distortion was gone, just my own tired, pale face staring back. I set the mirror aside, heart still racing, and allowed myself a small breath. The room was silent now, almost serene, as if the act of discovery had temporarily appeased it. I stayed in the hidden room for what felt like hours, examining papers, photographs, and objects. Each item told a fragment of a story I could not piece together fully, though the narrative was clear enough. Someone here had believed themselves watched, pursued, observed by unseen eyes. Their life had become a catalog of observation and fear, every movement recorded, every sound noted. The cabin, the forest, and perhaps something else entirely had been part of their world, always present, always patient. Eventually, I stepped back, closing the loose board carefully behind me. The hidden room was once again concealed, silent, keeping its secrets intact. I turned toward the main room of the cabin and paused, listening. The shadows had shifted slightly, settling back into the corners as if they had noticed my intrusion and allowed me to leave unchallenged. The whispering, creaking, and sighing of the cabin felt less insistent now, though still present. It was patient, waiting. I sat back at the table, staring at the scattered letters and photographs I had brought from the hidden room. Each one seemed to vibrate with the presence of the person who had lived here before me. Their obsessions, their fears, their careful cataloging of the unseen, all of it pressed against me now in the quiet, in the soft shadows. The forest outside remained dark, indifferent, yet somehow knowing. I realized that night in that hidden room that the cabin had been a stage for quiet horrors, subtle and persistent. Not sudden, not loud, but creeping. The kind that burrowed into your mind and lingered long after the night ended. I understood, finally, why the cabin had felt so alive, so patient, so aware. Every board, every scratch, every note and photograph was a fragment of someone's obsession, and now it had become part of mine. As I lay down on the warped chair later that night, I could not shake the feeling that the hidden room remained with me, its weight pressing gently on the edges of my mind. The whispers, though faint, seemed closer, brushing at the corners of my ears. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that I would not forget this place. I would carry it with me, the memory of a life lived in vigilance, in fear, in observation. The cabin, the hidden room, the forest, they had claimed a part of me now, and there was no turning back. The morning brought silence. Snow had fallen overnight, soft and thick, blanketing the forest in a quiet white that made the world seem smaller, slower, and heavier all at once. I stepped outside the cabin, the cold biting through my coat, and felt the crunch of the snow under my boots. Everything looked pristine at first, untouched by human hands, the kind of flawless calm that almost made the heart ache. But then I noticed the footprints. They were small at first, scattered near the edge of the cabin as if someone had walked lightly, almost dancing across the snow. I stopped, breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air, and knelt to examine them. They were too regular to be animals. They were human, or had been. But the way they led away from the cabin toward the woods was strange. The prints never returned, never looped, just disappeared among the trees, leaving me staring at them and wondering if they had ever existed at all. I followed them slowly, careful with each step. The snow muffled my movements, the world around me hushed, yet the prints seemed deliberate, a guide into the forest. My mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps a neighbor, someone passing through, though none lived nearby, at least not close enough to wander in the snow this early. Perhaps I had imagined them, the combination of stress, isolation, and the cabin's history pressing on my thoughts. But the footprints were real, fresh enough to leave edges raised, fragile ridges in the soft snow. I walked a few yards into the trees, flashlight cutting narrow beams through the branches. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last, not from snow, but from the weight of the forest's stillness pressing against me. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, only the faint wind threading through the branches above. The footprints led deeper into the woods, meandering slightly, never straight, like someone or something had paused, looked around, then continued. But I saw no one. I felt no one. And yet I knew I was being watched. The prints ended abruptly near a clearing where the snow lay undisturbed, except for faint depressions that might have been animal tracks, or might have been nothing at all. I knelt, running a gloved hand over the snow, feeling the cold seep into my skin. Nothing. Not a single mark of movement continuing beyond the clearing. It was as if the prints had simply vanished into the air, leaving only the snow and the trees. I swallowed hard, heart thudding in my chest, and glanced back toward the cabin. The roof lines were still visible between the trunks, the chimney releasing a faint wisp of smoke, the forest pressing in around me. I realized then that I was alone, or that I should have been. My mind flashed to the hidden room, the diaries, the photographs of someone watching, someone who had counted steps, who had recorded every creak, every whisper. And now it seemed the forest itself had taken up that vigilance, that quiet, observant attention. I returned to the cabin slowly, each step deliberate. My boots crunched in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. The door loomed ahead, slightly ajar, a dark rectangle against the soft white of the snow. I hesitated, imagining the cabin breathing, waiting, patient as always. I opened it carefully, letting the cold in behind me, and stood in the main room. The shadows were familiar now, yet they seemed thicker, darker, almost tangible in the morning light that filtered through the windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and earth, the same combination I had noticed in the hidden room. I moved toward the table, running my fingers over the scattered letters and photographs. The snow outside contrasted sharply with the warmth of memory these items carried, the weight of someone's life spent in vigilance and fear. I wondered if the footprints had been real, or if the cabin had conjured them as a reminder, a quiet warning that the past was never truly gone. I glanced toward the back of the room, toward the loose board that hid the concealed space. A flicker of doubt ran through me. Had I been alone in exploring it? Or had the cabin, in some subtle way, guided me there, encouraged me to find what it wanted me to see? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease lingered, a soft, persistent pressure in my chest. The afternoon passed slowly, the light shifting and deepening, drawing the shadows longer. I sat by the window, watching the snow settle in quiet layers on the trees, on the roof, on the small path that led away from the cabin. The forest looked serene, almost inviting, but I could not forget the footprints. They were a riddle, a trace of a presence that might never reveal itself, leaving only a slow, creeping unease. As night approached again, the temperature dropped and the wind began to stir. I moved back to the fireplace, checking the wood and the old stove. There was warmth here, but it felt thin, fragile, as if the heat could not hold back the watching. Outside, the wind threaded through the trees, soft and irregular like whispering voices, echoing the traces of the footprints. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I realized I had been holding my breath, waiting, listening. And then I heard it, a single step in the snow outside, deliberate, measured, followed by another and another. I froze, eyes wide, straining in the dim light. The steps were near the cabin now, brushing against the snow like gentle taps, careful, almost hesitant. My pulse accelerated, though I tried to stay calm. Whoever or whatever was moving through the forest was following the same path, tracing steps I had seen hours before. But when I looked through the window, I saw nothing. Nothing at all. I stepped outside cautiously, flashlight sweeping the fresh snow, but there was no one. Only the footprints I had seen earlier, now partially covered by new flurries, leading once again toward the trees, vanishing where the light could not reach. My breath formed clouds in the cold air, and I felt the weight of the forest press closer, the shadows folding around me, patient and silent. The snow beneath my feet felt soft but endless, stretching into darkness beyond any clear view. I returned inside, closing the door behind me, listening. The creaks of the floor, the sighing of the walls, and the soft whistling of wind through the cracks filled the cabin, each sound magnified, deliberate, intentional. I realized I was part of a rhythm now, a slow cadence that the cabin and forest had established long before I arrived, and would continue long after I left. I could feel it in my bones, a steady, pressing presence that was not malicious, not overtly threatening, but persistent. Always observing, always patient. I moved to the table, tracing my fingers over the papers I had collected, thinking about the previous occupant, the person who had filled the hidden room with photographs and notes, documenting every sound, every movement. Perhaps they had heard the footsteps too, in their own way, in the quiet snow outside their own cabin. Perhaps they had waited as I now waited, unsure if they were imagining what they could not see. I realized with a sudden chill that I was not imagining it. The footprints, the snow, the forest, they were real, and they were aware of me. Hours passed with a slow inevitability. The snow continued to fall, covering and uncovering traces in the woods, hiding what had come before and leaving hints of what might come next. I watched the snow fall, the patterns of drifting flakes, the way shadows moved across the cabin walls in the cold light of my flashlight. My mind circled endlessly around the footprints, the way they had appeared and disappeared, the way they traced a path I could follow but could never fully understand. By the time I allowed myself to lie down in the old chair, I knew the night would bring more footsteps, Perhaps I would see them, perhaps only hear them. Perhaps they were echoes, traces left behind by someone long gone, or perhaps by something still patient, still present in the forest outside. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself that I was alone, telling myself that the footprints were a mystery that might never be solved. And yet in the darkness I could feel them. The subtle weight of movement just beyond the window, the soft, deliberate presence pressing against the edge of perception, watching, patient, persistent, and unseen. The day had been long, though the sun's retreat made it impossible to measure time properly. I had wandered through the forest again, tracing the snow-covered paths, staring at the prints that had appeared and disappeared as though guided by unseen hands. By the time I returned to the cabin, twilight had settled into the corners, stretching shadows long across the floorboards, folding the room into muted shapes. The air felt heavier now, not just with cold but with the presence of the cabin itself, patient and unyielding. I moved toward the small table where the old candle rested half-used, a fragile pillar of wax that might have survived years of neglect. I had been saving it for tonight, feeling instinctively that it would make the darkness more bearable. My fingers brushed the wick, dusted in fine powder, and I struck a match, bringing it close. The flame flickered uncertainly, then steadied, casting a soft, wavering light that transformed the room. The shadows danced slowly along the walls, stretching into shapes my mind tried not to name. Sitting on the warped chair, I held the candle before me, letting its warmth seep into my hands. The cabin felt smaller now, more intimate, yet no less strange. I could hear the wind brushing against the roof, rattling the single window pane, and somewhere in the distance, faint creaks and groans echoed through the forest. They were soft, subtle, almost like the world itself was stretching awake and testing my attention. I tried to focus on the candlelight, on the wax, the flame, the fragile glow that held the shadows at bay. The earlier footprints in the snow returned to my mind, a puzzle I could not solve. They had led nowhere, vanished into the trees, leaving me with only questions. Who had walked there? Who or what had traced those steps? And why did the forest feel more aware now than before, pressing closer to the edges of the cabin, as if leaning toward the warmth of the flame, the fragile presence of someone alive? I glanced at the table where the diaries and notes from the hidden room lay. The pages seemed heavier now, as if they remembered my touch. And the words I had read hours before echoed faintly in my mind. "They follow without sound," one note had said. "The dark is patient. It watches." I had laughed softly at the time, trying to convince myself it was just fear, just imagination. But the longer I sat with the candle, the more I realized that the cabin, the forest, the snow, and even the shadows themselves were patient in ways I could not fully comprehend. I opened one of the diaries again, fingers tracing the jagged handwriting. The entries were short, fragmented, and increasingly frantic as the writer described nights spent listening, waiting, observing. There were mentions of whispers that seemed to come from outside the walls, sounds that carried over the wind, voices that the forest carried like smoke through the trees. Reading them now by candlelight, I felt the same slow creeping anxiety that must have filled the writer. The flame flickered and I heard a soft tap against the window. I froze, letting the candlelight fall across the floorboards. My breath formed thin clouds in the cold cabin air and I strained my ears, waiting. Another tap. A whisper, soft, almost tender, carried by the wind, unintelligible yet distinct. I told myself it was nothing. The trees moved, the branches touched the cabin, a loose shutter or some snow sliding from the roof. Yet I could not shake the feeling that someone, or something, was aware of me, listening as closely as I was listening to it. I placed the diaries back on the table and turned toward the shadows that pooled in the corners. The light reached only so far, and beyond it, shapes gathered and stretched, folding in and out of the darkness like smoke. I wanted to stand, to move, to check the corners, but a slow, insistent dread held me in place. The cabin seemed to inhale around me, patient and still, yet aware. The creaks of the floorboards, the subtle hum of the walls settling, and the whispers drifting from outside pressed against my senses. I thought again of the hidden room, the collection of photographs, letters, and personal objects. Each one told the story of someone who had lived here, observed and recorded, documenting every creak, every shadow, every trace of movement. Their life had been consumed by vigilance, a slow, patient obsession with unseen watchers. And now, sitting by candlelight, I realized I was in the same position. The cabin had drawn me into its rhythm, its quiet obsession, its patient counting of breaths and footsteps. The flame flickered, casting the room into darkness for a moment before steadying again. I felt the cold from the window more keenly now, though I had long since closed it. The wind carried with it faint whispers, soft enough that I almost doubted my hearing. They swirled around the cabin like smoke, brushing against the walls, the table, the diaries, and even me. I could not understand them, could not interpret the language or intent, yet I felt their presence, patient and persistent. Hours seemed to stretch in the candlelight. I watched the shadows shift slowly, drawn by the flame, and felt my own heartbeat echo in rhythm with the creaks of the cabin. Sometimes the light illuminated a floorboard that groaned under its own age, or a corner that had always seemed dark and endless. And always, the whispers, soft and deliberate, threaded through the room. They were neither threatening nor comforting, only present, patient, as if they had always been part of this place. I thought of sleep, though the idea was distant. The previous occupant had written of nights spent awake, listening, recording, marking every subtle sound, every creak, every shadow that moved at the edge of perception. I understood now why. The cabin allowed you to be alone, and yet it reminded you constantly that you were not. It breathed with patience, observed with quiet diligence, and watched with a stillness that was impossible to resist. I moved slightly in the chair, adjusting myself, careful not to tip it over. My hands hovered near the candle, feeling the fragile heat, watching the flame dance and fold into shadows. I thought of the footprints in the snow, the vanishing traces, the forest that seemed alive and aware. And I realized that the cabin, the forest, and perhaps something else entirely had a slow rhythm, a deliberate patience that I had become part of. My presence was noticed. My attention was measured. My breathing, movements, and thoughts were acknowledged, though silently, subtly. The whispers grew slightly louder, brushing the edges of the walls, curling around corners, threading through cracks in the window frames. They were gentle, almost intimate, as if someone, or something, was speaking to me from just beyond understanding. I could not make out the words, could not parse the language, yet each sound pressed against my mind, weaving unease and attention together. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, my body tense, every nerve alert even as exhaustion claimed me. I thought of leaving the cabin, stepping into the snow, retracing the footprints, chasing answers that would never come. But the candle burned low, fragile and warm, and the shadows it cast were the only familiar things I had. The whispers persisted, soft, patient, curling around the edges of perception. They reminded me that the cabin's stories were not finished, that its history was ongoing, and that anyone who spent time here, even briefly, became part of it. I lowered my head, resting it on the edge of the table, letting the candlelight bathe my face. The shadows seemed to draw closer, leaning in with patient curiosity. I thought of the previous occupant, of their diaries, their photographs, their obsessive record of watchers and watched, and I realized that the cabin did not demand fear. It demanded attention. It demanded awareness. It required you to feel, to notice, to become part of its rhythm, its careful, quiet observation. The flame sputtered, then steadied. The whispers drifted outside the cabin walls, brushing against the roof, the windows, the snow-covered ground. They were faint, undecipherable, patient. I closed my eyes, letting the candle's warmth seep into me, letting the soft presence of the cabin and forest surround me. Sleep might come, or it might not. And if it did, the whispers would continue, the creaks would continue, and the quiet, patient observation of this place would endure, long after I left or even forgot the details of the footprints, the hidden room, the fragile candlelight. And so I waited, holding the candle, feeling its heat, listening to the wind, the whispers, and the patient creaks, knowing that the cabin and the forest were present, aware, and watching. I was part of it now, and the rhythm of observation would continue, slow, gentle, and insistent, threading through my thoughts, through the snow outside, through the shadows that leaned impatiently always. I had never been to the mountains where the cabin waited, but somehow, as I stood at the edge of the winding dirt road that led upward, I felt as if I already knew the place. My family's letters spoke little of it, just that it had belonged to my grandfather, untouched for decades, and that I was now its heir. I had imagined it as rustic, perhaps overgrown, maybe even in disrepair. But what I found was something else entirely. The road narrowed, twisted between towering pines, their needles brushing the sky, and the air smelled of cold stone, wet earth, and pine resin. Mist hung in the valleys below, pale and ghost-like, softening the edges of the world. I drove slowly, each turn revealing more of the mountain's quiet isolation. Occasionally, a bird would call somewhere in the distance, its voice distant, cautious, as if it too were aware of the strange quiet that draped the peaks. The cabin appeared suddenly, framed by snow-dusted evergreens. It was larger than I had imagined, its walls of weathered timber dark against the pale gray sky. The roof sagged slightly in places, though not alarmingly, and the windows gleamed faintly, reflecting the light in a way that made the place seem almost aware of my approach. It was silent, yet it held presence, as if the building itself had been waiting for me to arrive. I parked near the small porch and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots startling in the stillness. The door was heavy, the metal latch cold and stiff in my hands. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting dust, decay, or cobwebs. Instead, the cabin smelled of wood, earth, and a faint, lingering scent I could not name, something between smoke and memory. It was as if the air had been waiting for me, unchanged for decades, holding the residue of the lives that had passed through it. The interior was frozen in time. Furniture arranged neatly, objects placed as though someone might return at any moment, and the faint imprint of footsteps still visible on the worn floorboards. I walked through the main room, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through the windows. A large fireplace dominated one wall, cold now, though evidence of old fires remained. Ash collected neatly, logs stacked beside it. Chairs were angled toward the hearth, rugs lay flat without wrinkles, and shelves held books whose spines gleamed faintly with age. I ran a finger along one, feeling the dust of decades, and shivered. It was almost too perfect, too intact, as if someone had preserved it deliberately, refusing to allow the passage of time to leave its mark. I moved deeper into the cabin. Each room was similar, bedrooms untouched, closets closed, cupboards filled with objects I did not recognize. Clothes folded neatly, though the fabric was stiff and brittle with age. Dishes arranged as though in mid-use, cups and plates waiting silently for someone to return. The place felt alive, not in the obvious way of lights, movement, or sound, but in its careful stillness. Every corner seemed to hold attention, as if the walls themselves had witnessed generations passing and had recorded them silently, keeping them locked in place. I found a small writing desk in one corner, its surface covered with letters, journals, and photographs. I lifted one photograph carefully, dust motes floating in the light, and saw the face of my grandfather, younger than I had ever known him, staring back. His expression was unreadable, serious, maybe tired, maybe alert. Something about the eyes made me pause. I traced the lines of the photograph with a finger, feeling the chill of history pressing lightly against my skin. These were not just memories. They were preserved attention, careful observation, a life recorded in small, deliberate fragments. I explored the rooms quietly, each step measured, letting the silence guide me. Occasionally, the floorboards creaked under my weight, though less than I expected. The cabin seemed patient, waiting, as though it were assessing my presence, gauging whether I belonged here. The longer I stayed, the more I realized that the quiet was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of the lives that had passed through this place, the subtle traces of thought, memory, and careful habit left behind. In the kitchen, I found a small kettle, blackened slightly at the bottom, sitting on a worn stove. I set it aside carefully, noting the neatness of the surrounding shelves, the orderly arrangement of jars and utensils. Everything had been left as if the previous occupant might return at any moment. I thought again of my grandfather, of the person who had preserved this space so meticulously. What had driven such care? Perhaps habit, perhaps ritual, perhaps an unwillingness to let go of a world already passing beyond reach. I moved to the windows, looking out across the mountains. The valley stretched far below, mist curling between the peaks like smoke. The forest pressed close around the cabin, dense and indifferent. In the distance, a river glimmered faintly, and I could hear the soft, distant call of a bird. Otherwise, the world was silent. It was a quiet that weighed, pressing against the mind, making one acutely aware of every breath, every small movement. The mountains had their own rhythm, slow and deliberate, and the cabin mirrored it, holding time in place within its walls. I sat for a long while on the edge of a bed in the main bedroom, letting the silence settle into me. My thoughts wandered, half lost in the patterns of the wood grain, half occupied with the idea of who had lived here, who had preserved this place so carefully. It was not neglect nor abandonment. This was deliberate, a choice to maintain a world frozen in a particular state. And now, inheriting it, I had become part of that world. My presence mattered subtly, though the cabin would not announce it. As the light shifted outside, dimming into late afternoon, I explored the attic. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, but there were signs of recent visits. A single footprint, faint and unremarkable, yet noticeable, pressed into a corner where the dust had settled less heavily. I traced it with a gloved hand. The cabin had been empty for decades, yet it still seemed to respond to attention, recording movement, preserving evidence of presence. The sensation was both comforting and unsettling, as if the cabin itself were alive in some small, deliberate way. Returning to the main room, I lingered near the fireplace again. The logs, the chairs, the dust and silence, they all seemed to hum with memory. I felt the weight of the generations that had passed through, the patient attention of my grandfather, the careful preservation of a world I could barely imagine. This was more than inheritance of property. It was inheritance of silence, of presence, of observation. I realized that to enter this cabin was to step into a life already recorded, a rhythm already established. I found an old candle on the mantel, small and almost fragile. Lighting it, I watched the flame flicker against the walls. Shadows stretched slowly, dancing softly across the timber. The cabin felt alive in that moment, not threatening but aware, patient, waiting. I understood that this place had preserved more than objects. It had preserved the attention of those who lived within it, their care, their vigilance, their quiet consciousness. And now I was part of it. Sitting by the candle, I let my thoughts drift over the room, the windows, the distant mountains. The air smelled faintly of wood and earth, of smoke long extinguished, and the quiet wrapped around me, comforting and unsettling at once. I thought of the days ahead, of nights spent in this patient, attentive silence, and a small chill ran through me. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. A recognition that this cabin held life in ways subtle and deliberate, that the world outside moved differently than the world within these walls. And in that awareness, I understood something essential. The cabin was not just mine now. It belonged to the silence, to the patient attention it had preserved for decades. My presence mattered, but it mattered quietly, measuredly, as if the cabin had waited for me to arrive, and now it would observe how I chose to inhabit it. I felt a shiver of both connection and unease, knowing that in inheriting this place, I had become part of a long chain of lives marked by careful presence, deliberate stillness, and observation that stretched across generations. I closed my eyes briefly, listening to the subtle creaks of the floorboards, the faint rustle of wind through the trees, the weight of the mountains pressing around me. The cabin held its breath, and I felt mine fall into rhythm with it. Inheritance was not only about property. It was about quiet awareness, patient observation, and the slow unfolding of time within walls that could remember everything, yet reveal nothing. And now I was part of that memory, part of that deliberate frozen world, inheriting not only the cabin but its silence. The first thing I noticed when I returned to the cabin that evening was the way the shadows pooled differently than before. The fatting light from outside stretched long across the floorboards, and the interior, though familiar, seemed subtly altered. Dust motes floated in the air, glinting faintly in the waning light, and the cabin's stillness felt heavier, almost aware. I hadn't intended to examine the walls that night, but the portraits drew my attention as they always had. I had seen them earlier during my first exploration. The photographs and paintings of my family, long dead or long absent, their faces lined, serious or smiling faintly. They hung along the walls, framed carefully, and at first I appreciated them simply as history, proof that this cabin had held life, laughter, and perhaps sorrow. But tonight, under the dim, wavering light, I noticed something odd. A portrait of my great-grandfather caught my eye. He stared back at me, seated in a high-backed chair, hands folded neatly on his lap. At first, I thought it was the candlelight playing tricks on my mind, but then I realized his eyes seemed darker than I remembered. They were too deep, too hollow, as though some shadow had settled into them that hadn't been there before. I leaned closer, squinting. The shape of his eyes shifted subtly, the corners stretching just beyond recognition, almost as if he were aware I was looking. I stepped back quickly, feeling a chill creep up my neck. I moved along the wall slowly, studying each portrait in turn. Some of the older ones were faded, their colors muted, their edges curling with age. Yet as I examined them, I began to notice missing members. Faces that had been in earlier photographs now seemed gone entirely, replaced by blank spaces or blurred outlines. In one frame, a figure stood in the background, but the face was scratched out, or perhaps it had never existed, leaving only a smudge of gray where a person should have been. The more I looked, the more unsettling it became. Figures were subtly out of place. A child in one portrait seemed slightly taller than memory, or was it slightly older than expected? A woman's smile in another frame had shifted, the corners of her lips now tipped down in a subtle frown, almost imperceptible unless I studied it closely. My pulse quickened. I felt the cabin around me, patient and silent, pressing its attention against my awareness. Each painting, each photograph, seemed to observe me as much as I observed it. I remembered the journals I had seen in the main room, the careful records of observation, of noting the subtle movements of life within the cabin. Perhaps the previous occupant had noticed the same shifts, the same inconsistencies. Perhaps they had feared that the cabin recorded more than just time, more than just memory. Perhaps it held presence within its walls, patience that stretched across decades, stretching shadows into subtle movement, drawing attention to details that should not change. I leaned closer to a family portrait of my parents, their younger faces frozen in time. I had seen this photograph countless times in photographs at home, in albums, yet something was wrong. My father's hand seemed slightly higher than memory dictated, resting on the arm of a chair at an impossible angle. My mother's eyes were darker, almost too empty, as if the painter or photographer had captured not only their likeness but something beyond it. I felt a tremor of unease, the kind that starts small, like a whisper brushing across your spine, and grows into something insistent. I moved to a painting of my grandmother, standing beside the fireplace of the same cabin decades earlier. She looked older than she should have, yet also younger in the same glance. I squinted, noticing faint scratches across the canvas that I hadn't seen before, fine lines etched into the paint, tracing her eyes and mouth in subtle, deliberate patterns. I touched the frame cautiously. The scratches were there, yet I could not recall seeing them before. The cabin had kept these images, preserved them, yet allowed them to shift just enough that I could not be certain of memory or reality. The air grew colder as I moved from wall to wall. Shadows pooled, stretching into corners that were not quite corners, folding into spaces between the frames. I felt the weight of watching, as though the eyes in the portraits tracked me with quiet patience, noting every hesitation, every breath, every thought. It was not fear that gripped me, but awareness, the sense that I was not alone, and that the cabin, its walls, its portraits, and perhaps the memories themselves, were observing me as I observed them. I stepped back and took a deep breath, letting my eyes travel over the room. Some portraits seemed normal as they had when I first arrived, yet the more I focused, the more subtle changes I noticed. A child in one frame shifted position, slightly forward, as if leaning toward the room rather than being confined to the canvas. A man's hand rested slightly differently on a railing. A figure that had been facing sideways now stared directly at me. The changes were so slight that I questioned my perception, but the unease deepened, unrelenting. I moved toward the far corner, where a small cluster of frames hung closer together. A photograph of cousins I had never met, children of relatives long gone, had been altered. One of the children's eyes was scratched out, faint and jagged, yet the face around it remained intact. Another figure, a boy with a small dog, seemed taller, his head now almost level with the adult beside him. The room held these subtle discrepancies with patient calm, as if it expected me to notice, expected me to question my own memory and understanding. I thought of the hidden room I had discovered earlier, the diaries and notes meticulously kept by someone who had lived here before me. Perhaps they, too, had studied these portraits, these subtle movements. Perhaps the shifts were the cabin's way of marking its history, of reminding each occupant that memory is never fixed, that the past is malleable in subtle, insidious ways. The longer I observed, the more I realized that the walls themselves, the very timbers of the cabin, might record attention, preserve presence, and whisper it back in the smallest alterations, the faintest shifts. I sat on a chair, letting my gaze linger over the frames. The candle I had lit earlier flickered, casting shadows that seemed to extend from the edges of the portraits, blending with the subtle changes in the figures themselves. For a long moment, I allowed myself to believe it was all imagination, my mind, stressed and isolated, filling in small details and inconsistencies. Yet I could not shake the certainty that the cabin was patient, aware, and capable of subtle manipulation. The portraits were more than images. They were markers, reminders, guardians of memory that shifted just enough to unsettle the living. I traced a finger along the edge of one frame, the glass cold beneath my touch. A faint impression remained on my skin, almost like the warmth of the face within, though that made no sense. The child in the photograph seemed to tilt slightly toward me as I moved my hand, a movement so subtle I almost convinced myself I imagined it. And yet, the sense of observation remained, pressing gently against my mind. The cabin had eyes, or at least it had recorded eyes, and they were watching now. I stood slowly, stepping back from the wall, letting my eyes sweep over the room one last time. Each frame held its own subtle secret, a shift in position, a missing gaze, a scratch across the face. I realized with a quiet unease that this was not static, that the cabin, its walls, its memories, and its preserved attention were active in a slow, deliberate way. And I, like those before me, had become part of its rhythm, a participant in a careful, patient observation that stretched across generations. The shadows lengthened as the candle burned low, flickering and casting the figures in new patterns of light. I could feel their eyes in the soft glow, watching, aware, patient. The alterations in the portraits, the missing faces, the subtle shifts, they were not random. They were deliberate, a slow unfolding that measured time, presence, and awareness. And I, standing quietly in the dim cabin, could sense the weight of generations, the patient, deliberate memory pressing against me. I moved away from the wall finally, letting my gaze drift over the floor, the furniture, the subtle dust that had collected over decades. The portraits remained, patient and slightly altered, holding the stories of those who had lived here, those who had observed, and those who had disappeared or changed in memory. I understood in a quiet, sinking way that this cabin was not merely a building. It was a vessel of presence, preserving, recording, and subtly shifting the past into the present, reminding each living observer that memory is never fixed, and that the quietest places are often the most aware. I sat by the table again, letting the candlelight flicker over the scattered journals, photographs, and notes. The portraits watched me still, patient, subtle, and insistent. Their alterations were gentle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. I could not unsee them, could not ignore the faint unease pressing against my mind. The cabin had spoken in its own way, not with words or sound, but through the slow, deliberate changes in its preserved memory. And I understood then that I, too, had become part of its story. I had avoided the attic for the first 2 nights, telling myself it was nothing more than a dusty, empty storage space at the top of the cabin. But the locked door called to me with a quiet insistence, as though it knew I was ready to understand something I hadn't yet admitted. The key was small, cold, and oddly heavy in my palm, the same key I had found hidden in the back of an old drawer, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth. I stared at it for several moments before sliding it into the lock, the metal biting into my fingers, and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, reluctant, as though it had not been disturbed in decades. The attic smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint trace of mildew. A single window allowed a thin beam of moonlight to stretch across the floorboards, illuminating piles of forgotten belongings. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, crates of brittle newspapers, and trunks bound in rusting metal straps. The air was heavy and still, pressing against my chest, and I felt a tingle of awareness, a sense that I was stepping into a world that had been sealed away not merely to protect the things within it, but to protect me from them. I moved slowly, running my hands along the edges of the boxes. Some were labeled in my grandfather's precise hand. Documents, letters, family records. Others were unmarked. Their contents a mystery waiting to be revealed. I reached for a small box, unlatching it with trembling fingers, and inside were bundles of letters tied with frayed ribbon. I untied the top one and unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, yet there was an underlying tension in the letters that spoke of worry, secrecy, and fear. The first letter described a disappearance. My uncle, it seemed, had vanished without explanation one winter night. The writer, my grandmother, had scrawled frantic questions to someone unknown, a record of attempts to understand what had happened. The sentences were short, halting, filled with pauses and ellipses that suggested hesitation, uncertainty. As I read, I felt the chill of history pressing into me, the way the past could reach out, demanding attention, whispering warnings I was not entirely ready to hear. I set the letter down and picked up a small journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Flipping through the pages, I found entries that were more personal, almost confessional. They spoke of observing neighbors, family members, even servants, noting discrepancies, small lies, unspoken tensions. But the words grew darker as the pages progressed, detailing arguments, hidden resentments, and secrets buried in the snow and silence of the mountains. There were mentions of nighttime sounds, shadows moving outside windows, things glimpsed from the corner of the eye that had no clear explanation. One entry caught my attention. It described a night when a distant scream had echoed across the valley. The writer noted the direction it had come from, the time, the moon's position, and the reaction of each family member. There was no name attached to the event, only the record of fear and observation, and the chilling conclusion that no one outside the cabin had noticed, or if they had, no one had acted. I felt a tightening in my chest. The attic was not merely a storage space. It was a repository of memory, of the lives and deaths and disappearances that had taken place under the careful observation of those who came before me. I moved to another crate, heavier and bound in rusting metal. I pried it open to reveal stacks of official papers, property records, death certificates, and notices of missing persons. Some were my relatives, others were neighbors who had lived nearby long before I was born. Each one seemed meticulously preserved, cataloged with dates, times, and descriptions. The repetition of names, dates, and locations created a rhythm in my mind, a slow, creeping realization that the cabin had been a witness, quietly recording life and disappearance alike. As I sifted through the papers, I found photographs, black and white, some slightly yellowed with age. Faces stared back at me, frozen expressions of happiness or solemnity, yet some had been altered. Eyes scratched out, faces blurred, figures removed entirely. The subtlety of these changes disturbed me more than overt horror might have. There was a sense of intention, deliberate erasure, a record of what had been deemed unworthy of preservation, or perhaps too dangerous to remember. I traced one photograph with my finger, feeling the faint depression of scratches along the eyes. It was as if someone had marked them for forgetting, or warning, or both. I paused, letting the candlelight flicker over the walls, the floor, the scattered belongings. The attic was vast, yet each corner seemed intimate, pressing against me with the weight of its histories. I realized that the previous occupants had lived under the knowledge of hidden truths, that they had recorded, catalogued, and perhaps even monitored each other. The journals and letters were evidence of careful attention, obsessive vigilance that stretched into paranoia. And now, as I held these documents in my hands, I understood that the cabin had drawn me into the same orbit. A gust of wind brushed against the window, rattling it slightly, and I flinched, though the sound was gentle, almost polite. My eyes returned to the journal. There were sketches here, crude maps of the cabin and the surrounding forest, markings that indicated hidden spaces, secret passages, places where one might disappear without trace. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the end, the entries shorter, more fragmented, until they stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the weight of absence, the unspoken question of what had happened to the missing, and what had been hidden in the corners of the mountains. I placed the journal back on the crate carefully, feeling the chill of the air and the cabin pressing close. Footsteps, or what I thought might be footsteps, creaked faintly below me. I froze, listening. The attic had always been silent except for the occasional groan of timber settling, yet now I imagined subtle, deliberate movements echoing through the floorboards, a reminder that the house was not empty, and that its memory of presence extended beyond the living. The candle flickered again, and I realized that some of the shadows in the attic had shifted. Boxes that had once been flush against the walls now seemed slightly askew, small gaps that hadn't existed before. My mind raced, questioning what was real and what was perception, but the unsettling sense persisted. The cabin, and perhaps the attic itself, responded to observation, recording, and attention. It was patient, subtle, and meticulous, just as the journals and letters had been. I gathered a few more letters and documents, careful not to disturb too much. Each contained fragments of events, some mundane, some sinister. Stories of disappearances, arguments, brief notes of regret or fear, and always the careful recording of who had seen what. One letter described a person who had vanished into the woods behind the cabin, with footprints that ended abruptly near the edge of the forest. No one knew where they went, and the writer admitted to watching the empty path for hours afterward, documenting each branch that moved, each distant howl carried by the wind. The parallels to my own experience were unnerving, though I tried to convince myself it was merely coincidence. I moved toward the window again, the moonlight casting long shadows across the attic floor. I looked out over the mountains, the valley mist curling in pale ribbons, the snow glinting faintly on distant ridges. Everything seemed quiet, almost impossibly still, yet I felt the presence of those recorded histories pressing against me. The letters, the journals, the photographs, they were more than paper and ink. They were evidence of observation, patience, and the careful keeping of secrets that might never be revealed. I returned the last of the papers to their crates, feeling the weight of what I had discovered. The attic was not merely a storage space. It was a repository of lives, of absences, of the deliberate recording of events that could not be acknowledged elsewhere. I felt a chill, not of cold, but of awareness, understanding that the cabin had always held witness, that it had preserved memory with patience and precision, and that now I had become part of that history. Finally, I stood, letting the candlelight flicker over the crates, boxes, and scattered belongings one last time. The attic seemed to breathe with quiet patience, observing my presence, nodding my attention, and waiting. I understood that the cabin did not merely contain history. It preserved it, subtly altering perception, recording observation, and threading memory into the present in ways that were patient, deliberate, and unsettling. I closed the attic door behind me slowly, the lock clicking shut with finality. The key was heavy in my hand, a reminder that the secrets above would remain intact for the moment, yet the weight of what I had seen lingered. The cabin, the attic, the letters, the journals, they were all patient, observing, and aware in ways I could not fully understand. And I knew, with a quiet, sinking certainty, that my own story had become entwined with theirs, part of the slow, meticulous record of life, disappearance, and memory preserved within the walls of this old mountain cabin. The snow had fallen heavily the night before, settling across the mountains in a thick, muffled blanket that seemed to absorb every sound except the occasional groan of timber or the whisper of wind through the pines. I had gone to bed later than usual, the weight of the attic and its discoveries pressing in on me, and I remember lying awake, listening to the subtle noises of the cabin as the moonlight slipped across the floorboards. At first, it was the usual creaking of old wood, the faint settling of the structure after decades of cold winters, but soon I became aware of something else. It started softly, almost imperceptibly. A step, faint, deliberate, distant at first, somewhere near the entrance hall. I froze, listening, convinced my mind was playing tricks. The cabin had a way of making imagination feel real, shadows stretching longer than they should, floorboards groaning under their own weight. But this felt different. There was intention in the sound, a slow, patient rhythm that pressed against my awareness. I rose quietly, careful not to disturb the floorboards beneath me. The candle I had left burning flickered softly, casting pale light across the room. I scanned the cabin, eyes straining in the dim glow. The hallway was empty, the furniture untouched, the walls holding their patient, frozen attention. Yet the footsteps continued, fading and returning, always present just beyond my ability to locate. I wondered briefly if it was the wind, or perhaps an animal seeking shelter, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too measured to belong to anything living outside the human sense of thought. I moved toward the source of the sound, each step slow and cautious. My boots made soft impressions in the snow that had gathered at the threshold of the door I had neglected to close completely. The cabin seemed to shift around me as I walked, shadows pooling in corners, stretching along walls, echoing with the soft murmurs of memory. The footsteps faded for a moment, then returned closer, echoing across the wooden floors. My pulse quickened, yet I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to listen, to let the cabin's patient rhythm guide me. The source remained elusive. Each room I checked revealed nothing. Beds untouched, chairs angled as they had always been, the fireplace cold and empty. It was as if the sound belonged not to a visitor but to the cabin itself, recording, remembering, replaying moments long past. I recalled the attic, the journals, the photographs. Perhaps this was their echo, the preserved presence of those who had vanished, or those who had been recorded and remembered in the patient observation of previous inhabitants. I returned to the main room, letting the candlelight wash over the walls. The portraits stared silently, their eyes unblinking, their subtle alterations still visible in the dim glow. And yet, the footsteps were closer now, softer, almost hesitant, as though they had taken notice of me. I sank into a chair, letting my body relax against the weight of the night, trying to convince myself that it was merely the mind playing tricks, that the snow, the wind, and the isolated silence of the mountains were enough to conjure such impressions. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had little meaning here, stretched and folded by the patient quiet of the cabin. The footsteps moved again, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly in the hall outside. I imagined the walls themselves listening, the timber recording each movement, each breath. I thought of the letters, the hidden documents in the attic, the stories of disappearance and observation preserved for decades. Perhaps this was part of that continuum, a residual presence, the echo of someone long gone, still wandering the hallways in memory or in some way that defied explanation. I closed my eyes briefly, focusing on my breathing. The cabin seemed to exhale with me, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the faint, fading steps. Each echo in the floorboards reminded me that this place held attention, preserved it, and returned it to anyone who entered. It was patient, silent, and meticulous, marking the living as surely as it had recorded the dead. The sense of being observed was no longer abstract. It pressed gently against me, subtle and persistent, a quiet insistence that the cabin was aware. I remembered the journals again, and a particular entry describing the behavior of those who had disappeared into the woods or vanished within the cabin itself. The writer had noted the sensation of being followed, of footsteps echoing where no one could be. They had questioned their own mind, their sanity, yet recorded every detail carefully, obsessively, as though the act of documentation could preserve or protect them. I understood now that I was walking the same path, tracing the faint impressions of memory and presence that stretched across decades. The steps moved closer still, deliberate and slow, circling through the room in patterns I could not trace. I felt the weight of the snow outside, the isolation of the mountains, the patient silence of the cabin pressing against my ears, my skin, my mind. I wondered if the previous occupants had known this sensation, if they had ever lain awake listening to echoes they could not explain. Perhaps that was the cost of inheriting such a place. The quiet understanding that memory is not fixed, that the past persists and sometimes reaches forward, pressing its rhythm into the present. I rose again, stepping softly toward the hallway, the candlelight flickering against the walls. Shadows pooled, stretched, and contracted, as if moving in concert with the fading footsteps. I followed them, careful not to hurry, careful not to disrupt the measured rhythm that had begun to feel almost alive. The sensation was neither threatening nor comforting. It existed in a space between awareness and understanding, a quiet insistence that I was not alone and never had been. The staircase leading to the attic beckoned, and I hesitated. I could hear the faint, fading steps circling below, almost hesitant now, as if testing my reaction. The cabin's patient memory seemed to pulse with the sound, each echo a quiet reminder that this place held histories both known and unspoken, that secrets were preserved not only in documents or photographs, but in the very structure of the building itself. I wondered if the previous occupants had felt this too, if they had ever dared to record or confront what moved silently through the halls at night. I returned to my bed, letting the candlelight bathe the room in gentle warmth. The footsteps had slowed, becoming intermittent, almost as if the cabin had taken note of my resignation. I lay down, listening, the mattress creaking softly beneath me. The snow outside pressed against the walls, muffling the world beyond, and the cabin exhaled its long, patient breath. Occasionally, a faint creak, a whisper of movement in the hall, reminded me that the echoes had not ended. They would not end. The past was preserved here, patient, meticulous, and present in ways subtle and persistent. Sleep came slowly, hesitant, weighed by the sense that I was part of a continuum, one link in a chain of observation, preservation, and memory. The candle flickered low, casting shadows that merged with the fading light of the moon. And as I drifted into the fragile state between consciousness and dreams, I heard it again. A step, soft and deliberate, echoing across the floorboards, circling, fading, returning. I told myself it was imagination, yet the unease lingered, a quiet insistence that the cabin remembered, that it preserved, that it continued to watch. Even in sleep, the footsteps continued, gentle and deliberate, tracing patterns I could not see, inhabiting spaces both real and remembered. I felt their presence lightly on my skin, their rhythm pressing against my mind, and I realized that the cabin's memory was not confined to walls, documents, or photographs. It lived in sound, in shadow, in the subtle, patient echo of movement preserved across generations. I understood then that the family secret, whatever had been hidden, erased, or recorded, was alive still, inhabiting the very structure of the cabin, pressing gently, endlessly against anyone who came to live within its patient walls. The final memory of that night before sleep claimed me fully was the cadence of those fading footsteps, circling the room softly, a rhythm that would return in the quiet hours, a reminder that the cabin's history was not past but ongoing. Its patience was infinite and its observation unrelenting. I slept lightly, aware of every shift of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the timbers, every subtle creak that marked the presence of what had been, what had disappeared, and what persisted silently in the preserved attention of this old mountain cabin. I arrived at the cabin as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the surface of the lake. A thin mist hovered over the water, curling in soft, silent ribbons that moved with an almost deliberate patience. I had driven for hours along a narrow, winding road that disappeared into the mountains, each bend revealing denser trees, steeper cliffs, and the distant, echoing calls of unseen animals. By the time I reached the small dock, the mist had thickened, shrouding the lake in a gray, ghostly veil that made it hard to tell where water ended and sky began. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and weathered, though surprisingly intact. Moss clung to the roof in thick patches, and the boards under my feet groaned as I stepped onto the porch. A subtle, cold dampness lingered in the air, pressing softly against my skin, and the faint scent of pine, wet earth, and old wood mixed in a way that felt almost alive. I could hear the water lapping gently at the shore, a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to echo through the surrounding trees. I set down my bag and paused, letting my eyes adjust to the muted light. The fog hung low, drifting between the trees like slow smoke, and in the distance the cry of a loon or perhaps a heron reached me, soft, hollow, and strangely forlorn. I could not see the edges of the lake clearly. The mist erased details, leaving only vague shapes and shifting shadows. It made the world feel smaller, more enclosed, but also infinite, as though the fog itself contained secrets I had yet to uncover. The door to the cabin was old but sturdy. I pushed it open, and the smell of dust, wood, and faint mildew greeted me. Inside, the space was simple and sparse. A table in the center, a few chairs pushed neatly against the walls, shelves lined with jars and old tools. Everything seemed as though it had been left in a hurry or preserved carefully, frozen in time. I ran my hand over the table's surface, feeling the rough grain beneath my fingers, and wondered who had last occupied this place, and why it had been left so untouched. I moved to the windows, peering through the mist. The lake stretched endlessly, its surface a mirror of gray, broken only by occasional ripples. The fog softened the outline of the distant trees, making them appear like shadows leaning into one another. I noticed a small canoe tied loosely to the dock, swaying gently, yet no one was near. The isolation of the place pressed against me, a quiet, almost oppressive weight that made the hairs on my arms rise. I lit a candle I had brought inside, letting the flickering light chase away some of the shadows in the corners. The flame trembled, casting long, wavering shapes across the walls and floor. The quiet was almost complete, broken only by the soft lap of water, the faint creak of the cabin settling, and the distant, irregular cries of animals in the surrounding woods. It was the kind of silence that filled the chest, pressing gently but insistently against thought, and I felt my breathing slow as I let the sounds, or lack thereof, sink in. Exploring further, I found the small kitchenette at the back. The sink rusted slightly, a faint film of dust covering the counters. Cabinets hung slightly askew, their hinges squeaking softly when I opened them. Inside, I discovered some old dishes, a few cans of food, and a half-empty bottle of water. Nothing particularly remarkable, yet each detail added to the feeling that the cabin was not merely abandoned. It had been waiting, preserved, as if aware of who might arrive next. I stepped back toward the main room, letting my gaze drift across the floorboards. Each plank creaked under my weight, sending small echoes through the otherwise quiet cabin. The mist outside shifted with the evening breeze, curling in and around the trees, and I could see it pressing gently against the window's soft gray tendrils that seemed to move with intent. The thought struck me that I was not entirely outside the world. The lake, the mist, and the cabin all seemed aware of my presence, adjusting subtly, patiently. I found a chair by the window and sat down, letting my hands rest lightly in my lap. My eyes followed the surface of the lake, watching the mist swirl and drift. Occasionally, a ripple broke the stillness, concentric circles spreading outward and vanishing into the gray. A distant animal call echoed faintly, and I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing, hypnotized by the quiet, the subtle movements, the patient, pervasive presence of the cabin and its surroundings. There were signs of life, subtle but undeniable. Tiny footprints in the mud near the dock suggested a fox or a small raccoon had passed recently. Broken reeds along the shore hinted that birds had nested nearby. The evidence of these creatures, so small and quiet, made the world outside the cabin feel alive and watchful. Even the mist seemed to move with purpose, drifting across the water in gentle waves, curling toward the cabin and retreating again. I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed, not menacingly, but with patient attention, as though the lake and the fog were curious about my presence. Night fell fully, and the cabin became a small island of warmth in the gray expanse of mist and water. I lit a second candle and let its light mingle with the first, creating a soft, comforting glow that reached only so far into the corners of the room. The stillness outside deepened, punctuated by the occasional sigh of wind through the trees and the faint, soft splash of water against the dock. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the dampness of the evening press in from all sides, and considered the isolation of this place. I realized I was aware of every sound: the creak of the ceiling joists, the faint rustle of the walls as the cabin settled, the distant cry of an owl somewhere beyond the fog. Each sound was magnified in the quiet, carrying with it a subtle weight, a sense that the world outside and the cabin itself were attentive, patient, waiting. I thought of those who had come before me, those who might have lived here for weeks, months, or years, observing the lake and the mist in the same quiet manner, aware of subtle shifts in sound, light, and presence. I traced my fingers along the table, feeling the grooves and imperfections in the wood. My mind wandered to the way the fog moved across the water, drifting slowly, curling, retreating, and returning. It felt almost deliberate, a silent rhythm that matched the quiet of the cabin itself. The lake and the mist seemed alive in their own way, patient and careful, folding the world into subtle motions that were easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once noticed. I looked again at the window. The mist was thickening, spreading across the surface of the water and curling around the trees. The lake was almost completely obscured now, reduced to a gray expanse that reflected nothing but the faint light of the moon. Yet in that gray, I thought I could see shapes, subtle shifts as the mist moved, almost like figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease, reminding myself that the mind exaggerates in isolation, in quiet, and in the presence of unknown spaces. Still, the feeling persisted, a gentle, oppressive weight in the chest, a sensation that I was part of a larger observation, one that stretched beyond the walls of the cabin, across the surface of the lake, and into the mist. I thought of the stories I had heard of isolated cabins, of people coming to such places for solitude only to find themselves haunted by memory, presence, or quiet, inexplicable phenomena. Perhaps this was the same. Perhaps the cabin, the lake, the mist, and the surrounding mountains held witness, recording every movement, every sound, every moment. I sat there for a long time, letting the candle light flicker, letting my mind trace the subtle patterns in the mist, the slow ripples on the water, the distant cries of animals echoing across the lake. The isolation of the cabin was absolute, yet it was not empty. Something watched with patience, with quiet awareness. I could not see it, could not define it, yet I felt it in every creak of the floorboards, in every sigh of wind, and in the subtle movements of the mist over the water. Eventually, exhaustion settled over me. The quiet, oppressive atmosphere had a hypnotic effect, pulling the edges of awareness toward sleep. I let my head fall back, eyes tracing the dim outline of the window frame, the flickering candlelight reflecting softly on the walls. The mist outside remained, curling gently across the lake, patient, silent, and persistent. And as sleep began to pull at the edges of my consciousness, I carried with me the sense that this place, this cabin, the mist, the lake, and all that watched in quiet patience, was alive in ways I had not yet fully understood, and that it would continue to observe, silently and without end. I woke to a quiet that felt heavier than usual, as though the mist outside had thickened overnight and pressed itself against the cabin walls. The morning light struggled through the fog, pale and weak, casting soft, gray shadows across the floorboards. For a long moment I lay still, listening. The lake was silent, the animals distant, and the wind barely stirred the trees. It was a silence so complete that it pressed against the inside of my skull, and I realized, with a sudden, subtle dread, that the world beyond the cabin felt both closer and impossibly far away. I rose slowly and approached the windows, my footsteps muted by the old rugs on the floor. The mist outside swirled, curling in its patient, ghostly way. And that's when I saw it, markings etched into the condensation on the glass. Strange symbols, jagged yet deliberate, as if someone, or something, had pressed against the cold surface to leave a message. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The shapes were unfamiliar, uncomfortably angular, almost like a code, yet there was a rhythm to them, a repetition that suggested awareness, intention. I pressed my hand lightly to the glass, leaving my own imprint, and stared for several minutes. The symbols were not smudged by my touch, nor did they fade with the rising warmth of the room. They remained, persistent and deliberate, curling slightly at the edges like smoke caught midair. I stepped back, letting my eyes trace them slowly, trying to understand if I had seen them before or if they were somehow shaped by the fog itself. There was nothing in the cabin that resembled them, no pattern I could recognize, and yet I felt an unsettling sense of familiarity, as though I had glimpsed them in a dream or in the edge of memory. I moved around the room, checking each window. The symbols had appeared on every pane, their subtle, deliberate shapes mirrored in slightly different variations. I wondered if the condensation alone could form such patterns naturally, but I knew better. There was intention here. I felt the weight of eyes, real or imagined, pressing through the glass, observing. The mist outside seemed thicker than it had been when I arrived, curling and shifting, almost as if it were alive and moving in concert with these strange messages. I found myself tracing the shapes with my fingers again, lightly, as though my touch could decode a hidden meaning. The sensation of cold glass against my skin was sharp, but it did nothing to disrupt the patterns. I stepped back and watched them, letting the candlelight flicker across the panes. Shadows danced across the symbols, exaggerating their angles, and I realized that the morning light alone could not explain the strange weight of awareness that had settled over the cabin. I thought of the lake, of the fog, and of the way it had pressed itself against the windows overnight. Perhaps it was the mist itself, moving in patterns, leaving marks on the glass. But even as I considered this, I could not shake the feeling that the marks had been placed deliberately, with attention, as though someone, or something, had spent the night observing, recording, and leaving messages just beyond the reach of comprehension. I backed away from the windows and let my gaze drift across the cabin. The air was thick, almost tactile, and I realized that I was acutely aware of every sound: the creak of boards, the faint sigh of the wind, the occasional ripple of water against the dock. Each noise seemed amplified, echoing in a way that suggested attention, awareness, and a patient, deliberate rhythm. The cabin felt alive, not in the way a house creaks and settles, but in the quiet, insistent presence that pressed against perception, nudging thought and attention into uneasy focus. I sat at the table, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with a fingertip, trying to steady my thoughts. The symbols on the windows seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, curling and straightening, sometimes blurred, sometimes sharp, as though reacting to my gaze. I remembered the first day I had arrived, the way the fog moved, patient and precise, curling across the lake as if it had a mind of its own. Now it felt connected to the marks, part of a subtle communication that I could not yet understand. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, for time had little meaning in the fog. I watched the mist from the window, letting my eyes follow its slow, curling movements, tracing its path over the water and wondering if it was aware of me as much as I was of it. The symbols remained etched into the glass, unchanging yet alive, a quiet insistence that observation had occurred, that the cabin had recorded something during the night. I felt myself growing restless, the quiet pressure of the house and lake pressing against my chest, reminding me that I was not alone, even if nothing visible moved in the fog. I stepped outside briefly, letting the chill of the mist wash over me. My boots sank slightly in the damp earth near the dock, leaving small impressions that would fade with the next gust of wind or snow. The lake was gray, indistinct, the far shore lost in a dense, curling haze. The air smelled of wet pine and decaying leaves, and every small sound, the drip of water from the dock, the distant caw of a bird, the subtle rustle of unseen creatures, seemed magnified. I could not see anyone, could not hear footsteps, yet I felt observed. The symbols on the windows now made sense in a terrifyingly subtle way. The cabin itself had witnessed, recorded, and marked my presence, and I was only beginning to understand its quiet patience. Back inside, I tried to shake off the unease. I lit a second candle, the flames dancing softly across the walls, chasing shadows into the corners. Yet even in this gentle light, the symbols remained, curling on the glass like quiet warnings. I leaned closer, pressing my face to the pane, trying to discern if there was any pattern, any meaning I could grasp. The mist outside shifted in response, almost imperceptibly, curling around the dock, the trees, and the small cabin, as though aware that I was watching, aware that I had noticed the messages left behind. I recalled stories I had read of isolated places, of cabins in fog and forest, where visitors became aware of subtle presences, quiet observers who left marks that could be read only by those willing to notice. The thought made my chest tighten, a slow pressure that spread through my shoulders and back. It was a sensation I could not name, fear, anticipation, recognition, but it was real, tangible, and it grew in the quiet of the cabin, pressed against me with patient insistence. I spent the remainder of the morning moving from window to window, trying to understand the marks, tracing their angles with my fingers, testing the glass for irregularities. Each time, the symbols remained, unchanged, patient in their presence. I felt the weight of something unseen, observing me, learning my rhythm, aware of my hesitation and my curiosity. Even as I tried to convince myself that it was merely the condensation, the fog, and a trick of light, I could not shake the sense that attention had been paid, that the marks had been left as deliberate messages, silent and inscrutable. By mid-afternoon, the mist began to lift slightly, curling back over the lake in thin, wavering tendrils. The symbols on the windows remained, stubborn in their persistence. I realized that the cabin had its own language, one of subtle signs, quiet observation, and patient recording. The fog, the lake, the windows, and the old wooden walls all contributed to this ongoing dialogue, and I was only just becoming aware of my place within it. Evening approached, the light fading into pale gray once more. I sat in a chair by the window, the candle light flickering softly, and let my mind drift across the shapes etched into the glass. The mist had retreated, but the sense of observation remained, a quiet pressure in the chest, a subtle awareness of presence. I understood that the cabin had been alive with attention long before I arrived, recording, observing, and marking moments with patience and precision, and now it included me in its careful watch. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the candlelight and quiet settle over me. The symbols would remain through the night, etched into the glass with persistence, patient and deliberate, a reminder that the fog in the cabin had been present, had watched, and had recorded. Even as I slept, I felt the soft, persistent pressure of awareness around me, the subtle insistence of observation that would continue through the long hours of darkness, and I realized that the cabin's presence was patient, quiet, and enduring, and that it would not be easily forgotten. The mist had receded just enough that I could see the far side of the lake, though the water remained a muted gray mirror, reflecting nothing but shadows of trees and low clouds. Across the way, partially hidden by reeds and old fallen branches, was the boathouse I had glimpsed on the first day. A skeletal structure of wood, leaning slightly, its roof sagging, its walls blackened by years of weather and damp. The air between my cabin and the distant dock seemed to hum softly with quiet tension, a subtle vibration I could feel in my chest more than hear with my ears. I took a deep breath and grabbed the small rowboat tied loosely at my dock, testing the rope gently to make sure it would hold. The water lapped silently at the hull, soft and patient, almost as if it knew the journey I was about to take. I pushed off slowly, each stroke deliberate, keeping the boat steady against the gentle sway of the lake. The mist clung to the surface, curling around the bow like soft fingers, hiding the far shore from view until I was almost upon it. As I approached, the boathouse revealed itself more clearly, its wooden planks warped and mottled with age. Windows, long shattered, gaped like empty eyes, and the door hung slightly off its hinges, creaking faintly when nudged by the wind. Something about it drew my attention, a quiet insistence that I approach, that I look closer. The sense of previous presence was overwhelming. I could feel it in the air, thick with the damp scent of rotting wood and stagnant water. This place had been visited. Not recently, perhaps, but by people who had left parts of themselves behind. I stepped out of the rowboat and onto the dock, the boards groaning beneath my weight. The water shone dimly beneath the fog, reflecting the soft light that seeped through the clouds. I walked carefully toward the boathouse, noticing details I might have missed from a distance. A rope coiled neatly near the entrance, a broken paddle lying partially submerged at the edge of the dock, a tattered life jacket snagged on a nail. Each object seemed to whisper a story of sudden absence, of interrupted movement, of a presence that had vanished without warning. Inside, the boathouse was darker than I expected, though the broken roof allowed small shafts of light to pierce through, illuminating patches of the floor in pale gray. The air was thick and musty, carrying the smell of algae, mud, and something faintly metallic, almost like rusted blood. I stepped cautiously, listening to the echo of my own movements, aware that any sound I made seemed amplified in the quiet, hollow space. Scattered across the floor were items that had clearly been left behind by previous visitors. A notebook, its cover water-stained and curling at the edges, lay open to pages filled with handwriting that I could not entirely read. A pair of gloves, stiff and blackened with age, rested atop a small crate. There was a thermos, dented and half-filled with water that had become stagnant over time. Each object felt as though it were waiting, preserved in the quiet of the boathouse, holding onto a memory that had not yet faded. I picked up the notebook and carefully turned the pages. The handwriting was hurried in some areas, neat and precise in others, and the words spoke of evenings spent observing the lake, of strange shapes in the mist, of whispers that seemed to drift across the water from nowhere. There were references to visitors who had disappeared, unnamed and unrecorded, as if the writer had been chronicling events the world had refused to notice. The tone was both careful and anxious, a delicate balance between fascination and fear. I felt my chest tighten as I read, the words imprinting themselves like shadows across my mind. One page caught my eye. It was a crude sketch of the lake and the cabin, the boathouse, and the rowboat I had just used. Little symbols marked the shoreline, jagged lines that suggested movement, almost like footprints or the shifting of something hidden beneath the mist. I traced them with my finger, feeling a chill that spread slowly from my hands through my arms. The lake seemed suddenly alive, aware, a quiet participant in the events described. The sense of observation, the feeling I had felt in my own cabin, was here as well, patient, silent, and persistent. I placed the notebook back down and walked further into the boathouse, running my hand along the walls. The wood was rough and cold, damp from years of fog and rain. Small, faded markings were carved into some of the planks, initials, dates, and symbols I did not recognize. Some were old, weathered almost to illegibility. Others were sharper, fresher, as if someone had been here more recently than the years I had imagined. The boathouse seemed to record every visitor, every touch, every movement preserving them quietly in the timber itself. Near the back, I found a small chest partially hidden beneath a pile of fishing nets. Its lid was warped but could still be lifted, revealing an assortment of objects. A compass with a cracked glass face, a tarnished pocket watch, a photograph faded with time. Each item seemed ordinary yet out of place, carrying the weight of absence. I examined the photograph. 3 people smiling at the camera, their features cheerful, yet something in their eyes made me uneasy. It was as if they had known or sensed something beyond the frame, something unseen that waited in the mist. The floorboards beneath me creaked and I froze, listening. The boathouse was silent again, save for the faint rustle of wind through the broken roof and the soft lapping of water outside. Yet the sense of attention remained, pressing gently against my mind, a quiet insistence that I was not alone, that the objects around me were more than relics. They were remnants of observation, fragments of stories that had ended without conclusion. I stepped toward the door and peered outside. The mist had returned, curling across the water, soft and insistent. The lake was gray and still, but I felt its presence in a way I could not fully explain. The boat rocked slightly against the dock, though no wind disturbed it, and I noticed faint ripples in the water that seemed too deliberate to be random. I swallowed slowly, my pulse steadying even as my mind wrestled with the quiet sense that someone, or something, was watching from the far side of the lake, from the shadows of the reeds, from the patient, curling mist. I returned to the chest and examined the objects more carefully. The compass, though cracked, still pointed in a steady direction, as though it recognized some subtle magnetic pull beyond ordinary navigation. The pocket watch ticked faintly, though it had no visible battery or spring, its rhythm slow and deliberate, in time with the quiet of the lake itself. I realized then that this place was preserved not only by wood and stone, but by attention, by the careful, deliberate recording of those who had come before, and perhaps by the presence that lingered still, hidden in the mist. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, as I cataloged the objects, traced the markings, and studied the notebook. The light shifted, fog thickened and thinned, and shadows moved across the interior of the boathouse, merging with the shapes cast by the objects. Each movement, however subtle, carried with it the faint echo of previous observers, a rhythm of observation and absence that had persisted across time. The boathouse was not merely abandoned, it was patient, aware, and full of memory. When I finally stepped back into the rowboat, the mist had settled into a soft gray curtain, stretching across the lake like quiet smoke. I felt a strange, lingering weight in my chest, a subtle reminder that the lake, the boathouse, and the mist had observed me as much as I had observed them. I rowed slowly back to my cabin, each stroke deliberate, my eyes scanning the fog for subtle movement, for the reflection of presence, for signs that the stories of previous visitors were more than relics. They were warnings, or perhaps invitations to participate in a continuum of observation that I was only beginning to understand. By the time I returned, the sun had begun to fade behind the mountains, and the mist had begun to curl around the cabin once more, patient and persistent. I secured the boat and returned inside, letting the warmth of the candlelight chase the chill from my fingers and face. The boathouse across the lake seemed to retreat into shadow and fog, yet its presence remained in my mind, a quiet reminder of absence, observation, and the patient recording of stories that had ended, or perhaps had not yet ended. I sat by the window long after, watching the mist curl across the water, tracing subtle patterns that might have been intentional, or might have been the soft, deliberate movement of the lake itself. The notebook, the objects, the markings, they remained vivid in my mind, fragments of people who had been here, who had disappeared, who had been preserved in quiet attention. And as night settled, I realized that I would carry this sense of presence with me, patient and silent, across the days and nights to come, just as the lake and the boathouse had carried it before. The morning was quiet in a way that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. The lake lay still, gray and unbroken, shrouded in a thick blanket of fog that had drifted back over the water during the night. I could barely see the far shore. The trees faded into nothingness, their silhouettes curling like faint sketches. Even as I stepped onto the dock, the mist seemed to reach for me, curling around my legs, settling into the hollow of my elbows, pressing softly against the skin as if curious. It was then that I heard it. A whisper, soft and distant, carried across the water, barely perceptible, almost swallowed by the fog. I froze, my hand on the railing, straining to hear. The words were indistinct, carried on a rhythm I could not place. They were human, but not in any way that made sense, quiet, breathless, like conversations filtered through time and distance. I held my breath, listening, telling myself it was the wind, the rustle of trees, the occasional bird or loon calling from somewhere unseen. Yet I knew with an unease that tightened my chest that the sounds were deliberate. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock, peering into the gray, searching for anything that could explain the voices. The lake was still, the surface mirror-like, reflecting nothing but the gray sky and the curling mist. The fog shifted gently, curling over the water, concealing the far shore entirely. The whispers came again, soft and indistinct, like fragments of conversations overheard in another place, another time. I could not make out words clearly, but the cadence suggested argument, discussion, exchange, human presence without form. My mind began to question everything. Had I imagined it? The nights had been long and quiet, filled with observation and subtle unease. The mist, the cabin, the boathouse, all had felt like patient watchers, recording my movements, and now this, voices carried across the water, made me wonder if I had been alone at all. Each whisper seemed to press against my mind, teasing, pulling my thoughts toward questions I could not answer. Were they real? Were they remnants of the people whose belongings I had found at the boathouse? Or had the isolation begun to warp my senses, conjuring presence from silence? I walked slowly along the dock, letting the boards creak underfoot, trying to ground myself. The air was cold, damp, carrying the scent of wet wood, algae, and earth. Every sound was amplified. The faint drip of water from the dock, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, the distant rustle of trees swaying in a wind I could barely feel, and always the whispers, just at the edge of comprehension, flowing across the fog like a current I could neither follow nor resist. I leaned against the railing, pressing my forehead to the rough wood, letting my eyes close. I focused on breathing, on the rhythm of my heartbeat, trying to convince myself that the whispers were only echoes of imagination. But when I opened my eyes, the fog seemed thicker, denser, curling around the surface of the lake in slow, deliberate waves. The voices returned, slightly clearer, fragments of syllables that hinted at meaning I could not grasp. I felt a pull, a subtle tug in my chest that urged me closer, deeper into the fog, toward whatever waited unseen. I sat on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water, and listened. The whispers shifted, flowing in patterns that suggested awareness, as if whoever or whatever was producing them could sense my hesitation. One voice sounded distinctly male, low and almost conversational, another female, soft and urgent. They did not speak to me directly, yet each syllable brushed against my consciousness, threading through my thoughts, weaving a rhythm I could not escape. The lake was no longer a mirror of stillness. It had become a conduit, carrying sound across space in a way that defied explanation. I tried calling out softly, testing the air. My voice seemed swallowed instantly by the fog, returning only as faint echoes that could have been my own imagination. The whispers did not respond, but they shifted subtly, almost impatiently. I realized then that this was not random. There was a pattern, an intention behind the movement of sound, as if I were being observed, studied, noted. The mist and the water, the lake itself, had become instruments in this quiet, invisible conversation. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. I remained on the dock, barely moving, allowing the whispers to wash over me in gentle waves. They were not loud, they never became threatening, yet the persistence of their presence was suffocating in its subtlety, pressing against the edge of my mind. I began to lose track of where my thoughts ended and the whispers began. the line between perception and reality blurring. The fog twisted across the water, curling and folding in ways that suggested form, presence, yet revealed nothing tangible. I thought of the boathouse, of the notebook and objects I had examined the day before. Perhaps these were echoes of past visitors, imprints left on the lake, the mist, and the surrounding woods. Perhaps the people who had disappeared had left their presence lingering, woven into the environment, repeating fragments of thought and conversation for anyone attuned enough to notice. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. I was not alone, yet alone in a way that no human presence could have mitigated. The light shifted slowly as the day waned. The fog thickened again, curling over the lake in heavy gray layers, obscuring the far shore completely. Shadows emerged in the mist, vague shapes that suggested movement, yet always dissipated before I could focus. My eyes strained, but I saw nothing definite, only suggestion, implication, patterns that teased the edge of comprehension. The whispers continued, flowing around me like water itself, brushing against memory and imagination in ways I could not untangle. I realized then that time had little meaning here. Hours and minutes blended into one another, stretched thin by the monotony and intensity of the quiet. The whispers became part of the rhythm of my day, the gentle pulse of observation and attention that had begun to dominate my perception. I moved carefully, each step deliberate, each gesture slow, attuned to every subtle shift in the fog, the water, the whispering air. I thought of sleep and of the long nights to come. The cabin had already established itself as a space of quiet observation, patient and unyielding. Now the lake and the fog added their own layer, carrying fragments of voice and presence across the water, making the world feel alive in ways I could not fully explain. I understood that my senses were stretched thin, that my mind was processing signals it had never learned to recognize, that I was becoming part of the environment's patient awareness. By the time the sun fully dipped behind the mountains, leaving the lake and cabin in shadow, the whispers had grown slightly clearer, though never coherent. Words emerged briefly, fragments of sentences that made no sense but carried an unmistakable rhythm of intent. I could sense the pattern beneath the chaos, the careful, deliberate shaping of sound and space by something unseen, something attentive. I shivered, not from cold, but from the realization that observation was not passive here. It was persistent, subtle, and eternal. I returned to the cabin, stepping softly through the damp grass along the shore. The whispers continued, faint now, brushing against the edges of hearing, echoing across the lake in the mist. Each step I took was measured, aware that the fog could conceal more than it revealed. When I closed the door behind me, the candlelight flickered against the walls, casting soft shadows, yet I could still sense the presence of attention beyond the cabin's warmth. The whispers lingered outside, threads of sound weaving into the fog, patient and persistent. Sitting by the window, I traced the patterns of the fog across the lake, letting my eyes follow the curling shapes. I realized that the voices would continue long after I had retired for the night, drifting across the water, shaping the mist, and recording my presence with quiet insistence. Sleep would not erase them. They were part of the lake, part of the fog, part of the patient, observing world that surrounded the cabin. And I, like all who had come before, was now a participant in this subtle dialogue, caught between perception, memory, and the quiet insistence of presence. Even as darkness fell fully and the candlelight cast trembling shadows across the room, I could hear them still. Faint, patient, elusive, the whispers of voices carried on the fog across the water, threading through my thoughts and weaving themselves into the quiet rhythm of the night. I felt their attention, careful and deliberate, and I knew that the lake and the cabin were not simply landscapes. They were witnesses, keeping record, observing, waiting. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow, letting the candlelight and quiet settle over me. The whispers continued, flowing gently in the distance, a reminder that I was not alone, that presence extended beyond walls and water, and that reality itself was subtly shifting under the patient gaze of the fog. And as sleep began to take me, I carried with me the knowledge that the voices would linger, patient, deliberate, and eternal, echoing across the lake and curling through the mist long after I had closed my eyes. The morning broke pale and silent. The lake stretched before me like glass, smooth and unbroken, reflecting the gray sky above. The fog still lingered along the edges, curling in slow, deliberate motions. But it seemed thinner now, more hesitant, as if unsure whether to cling or drift away. I stepped out of the cabin quietly, feeling the chill of dew-soaked grass under my feet. Every step was careful, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the land itself was watching, recording, remembering. I walked toward the water's edge, drawn by the strange magnetism that had gripped me since my arrival. The lake's surface mirrored the sky perfectly, but in the reflection there was something off. Shapes swam in the gray reflection, subtle distortions at first, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. When I moved my head, they seemed to shift, bending with the water in ways that made no sense. I stopped, holding my breath, staring. The reflection of the cabin, my boat, the reeds, all appeared slightly warped, and in the spaces between I thought I saw figures, vague, gray shapes, humanoid but indistinct, moving just beneath the surface, in the corners of the mirror. I blinked, they were gone, or perhaps they were always there, waiting for me to notice. I reached toward the water as if touching it could confirm reality, and the surface rippled lightly beneath my fingertips. The shapes dissolved for a moment, but the sense of watching remained, a pressure at the back of my mind that made my skin prickle and my chest tight. I pulled my hand back, shivering, telling myself it was imagination, exhaustion, the isolation getting to me. Yet the pull was persistent. The fog swirled gently, curling across the lake, and I realized I had spent hours at the dock, listening, observing, caught in the quiet rhythm of the lake. The whispers, the boathouse, the objects, they all came together in this moment, the culmination of attention, memory, and presence that seemed to occupy the space between water, mist, and mind. I felt small, fragile, exposed in a way that I could neither fully articulate nor ignore. I took a deep breath and stepped back from the water, the damp chill soaking through my shoes. I walked along the shore, trying to find some grounding, some solid detail that would separate the lake from imagination. But everywhere I looked, the fog shaped itself around my thoughts. Trees became figures, reeds became hands, shadows became silent watchers. My mind strained to separate reality from suggestion, yet the subtle insistence of the mist made the effort almost futile. At the far edge of the lake, I saw movement. Not fast, not sudden, nothing that could be called a disturbance, but a slow, deliberate shift, like a shadow displacing water without breaking it. My heart thumped gently in my chest, awareness sharpened by the hours of quiet tension. The shape was humanoid, faint, gray, and elongated, drifting through the fog with patient intent. I froze, unsure whether to move closer or retreat, unsure whether to acknowledge what I was seeing or deny it entirely. The air felt thick, heavy, and still. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to escape the persistent sense of attention, yet I remained, drawn by fascination and fear alike. The shape shifted again, more distinct now, though still spectral, almost translucent, blending with the mist in a slow dance of ambiguity. I realized then that the lake itself had become a mirror, not just of the sky and trees, but of presence, memory, and attention. And that attention was directed at me. I turned, forcing my eyes away from the water toward the cabin, my boat, the familiar dock. Yet even there, the reflections persisted, warped in ways that suggested more than the physical objects. Each ripple in the water, each curl of fog, carried subtle impressions of figures, of movement, of attention that was patient, deliberate, and eternal. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly. I could feel the lake watching, recording, cataloging, and perhaps even communicating in ways that words could not capture. I made my way back to the rowboat, securing it tightly before stepping in. The oars felt heavier than before, though the water was still. Every movement required concentration, deliberate effort, as though the lake itself resisted my departure. I looked back at the cabin one last time. The shadows from the early morning lingered along its walls, the mist curling at its edges. It seemed smaller, fragile, and yet impossibly alive, resonating with the presence I had sensed since my arrival. As I pushed off from the dock, the water beneath the boat rippled gently, carrying reflections that shifted unnaturally. Shapes emerged, fleeting glimpses of figures standing or moving just beneath the fog, watching silently, patient, and deliberate. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of the water, slow, steady, cautious. The lake seemed to extend endlessly, yet every inch of its surface carried the same insistence: observation, memory, and quiet presence. Rowing toward the far side, I realized I was leaving only in form. The lake, the mist, the shadows remained a part of me. I could sense them in my peripheral vision, a subtle awareness that refused to dissipate. Each ripple, each wave carried hints of figures, ghostly and gray, blending with the fog in slow undulations. I ached to look away, to focus on solid land, on clear trees, on something tangible. But even as I tried, the awareness pressed gently, reminding me that observation was patient, constant, and unyielding. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, leaving the lake behind, I carried with me the sensation of being both present and observed. The fog receded slightly, dissolving into the morning light, yet in my mind the reflections persisted. Figures lingered at the edges of memory, drifting in the spaces between thought and perception, patient and silent. I knew I would carry them with me, even once the mist and lake were gone from view. I walked into the woods, following the path that led away from the water, every step measured, attuned to the quiet shift of branches and leaves. My thoughts churned between rational explanation and lingering unease. Perhaps it was fatigue, imagination, or the isolation that had stretched my senses beyond their normal limits. Perhaps the lake and its mist carried something far older, more deliberate, waiting for anyone willing to observe. As I moved deeper into the forest, the reflections from the water stayed with me. Every shadow seemed to flicker with presence, every rustle of leaves suggested subtle movement, and the patient gaze of figures long vanished lingered in my vision. I realized then that the lake, the mist, and the echoes of those who had been observed before had imprinted themselves onto my perception. I was no longer fully in control of what I saw. The world carried traces of attention that I could not escape. I paused once more, turning back toward the lake, now distant but still visible through gaps in the trees. The surface glinted faintly in the morning light, serene yet impossibly aware. Shapes swam just beneath, flickering and shifting in ways that defied explanation. The reflections were no longer merely images. They were fragments of a story, hints of observation, warnings, and invitations. I could not tell if they were remnants of the past or portents of the present, but their presence was undeniable, patient, and eternal. I left the forest and returned to the nearest road, my steps slower now, cautious. The lake was behind me physically, yet it remained alive in my mind, in my vision, in the subtle tension in my chest. Even hours later, as I tried to rest, I could see the shapes in my mind's eye, faint gray figures moving through mist, patient, deliberate, lingering in ways I could not fully escape. At night when I closed my eyes, I could feel the water under the boat, the ripples carrying reflections, the mist curling around invisible watchers. The shapes were never aggressive, never threatening in the conventional sense. They were patient, deliberate, eternal in a way that transcended fear. I realized I would carry their presence indefinitely, traces of the lake and fog embedded in my memory, in my perception, shaping every shadow, every ripple, every curl of mist I would see again. I knew I could leave the area, escape the cabin, the dock, the lake itself, but I would never be free of the reflections. They had followed me, impressed themselves upon my mind, and their quiet persistence would remain patient and watchful in every gray morning, every curling mist, every mirror-like surface I encountered. I understood in a slow, creeping way that the lake had claimed something of me. Not my body, not my life, but my perception, my attention, my awareness. And in that it had achieved permanence. Sleep came reluctantly, carried by exhaustion rather than ease. Even then, as I drifted, the reflections lingered, curling through my dreams, soft and deliberate, patient and unyielding. The lake and its fog, the whispers and shadows had become part of me, a quiet, persistent presence that I could neither deny nor fully comprehend. And in the night, I realized that observation, patient, deliberate, eternal, was far more unsettling than any scream, any sudden movement. It was quiet, subtle, and infinite. I arrived in the village just as the sun began its descent behind the low hills. The sky was washed in pale golds and muted pinks, the kind of light that stretched shadows long and thin, making everything seem slightly unreal, like a painting half-formed. I could feel the cool breeze brushing across my neck, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, moss, and the faint tang of smoke from the chimneys of cabins tucked among the trees. It was quiet here, unnervingly so, and the stillness pressed against me in a way I hadn't expected. I had come seeking solitude, a place removed from the constant noise of the city. The cabin I had rented was near the edge of the village, a small cluster of homes arranged haphazardly along a narrow dirt road. As I approached, I noticed the slight tilt of the rooftops, the uneven boards of the fences, and the way the autumn leaves seemed to gather in quiet heaps at the corners of the yards. Everything was familiar in a sense, yet strange. The village itself felt like it had been frozen in time, moving at a pace just outside the rhythm of normal life. I paused outside the cabin, letting my eyes take in the surroundings. The trees were thick and dark, their branches tangled above the roofs, and the ground was mottled with fallen leaves, slick with dew. Across the street, a man worked in his yard, raking slowly, deliberately, his movements methodical to the point of being mesmerizing. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a face weathered by years of sun and wind. As I stepped closer, he looked up, and our eyes met for a brief moment. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then returned to his task. There was nothing overtly strange about the gesture, yet something in the way he held himself, the carefulness of his movements, and the weight behind that single nod made me pause. It was as if he were aware of everything around him, measuring not just his actions but the very air. I gave a tentative wave which he ignored. I didn't take offense. Instead, I felt a subtle unease settle in my chest, a quiet prickling that told me this man, for all appearances, was unlike anyone I had met before. I moved on toward the cabin, my bag swinging lightly against my hip, and past a few of the other villagers. Each greeted me with a nod or a whispered hello, their voices soft, cautious, almost conspiratorial. Their eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, shifting to the neighbor as if they were measuring the man through me. I caught fragments of conversation, mentions of him, words like reserved, keeps to himself, and quietly watchful. Every word was hushed, carried with a weight I couldn't quite place. It was as if even the wind might overhear them, and they feared it. The cabin itself was small, built of dark, weathered logs, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. It sat slightly apart from the other homes, backed by dense forest and overlooking a narrow stretch of the river that cut through the village. As I unlocked the door, I felt the familiar thrill of solitude, the sense that the walls themselves could hold me in safety. Yet the unease from the walk lingered, curling around the edges of my mind like smoke. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood polish, dust, and the faint lingering scent of past inhabitants. Everything was intact, arranged as though someone had stepped out moments ago, though I knew the place had been empty for months. I set my bag down and moved from room to room, my footsteps soft against the creaking wooden floorboards. Each window looked out onto the village, each shadow and sway of leaves outside carrying a sense of awareness, as though the forest itself were conscious of my presence. Later, as I unpacked the essentials, I could hear faint murmurs from beyond the cabin walls, the low hum of village life carrying softly on the evening breeze. I decided to take a walk, partly to stretch my legs, partly to understand the rhythms of this place. The road was narrow, lined with cabins and scattered trees, and the air carried a chill that hinted at winter yet to come. The fog had begun to rise from the river, a thin, curling layer that blurred the edges of buildings and trees, softening the world into muted shapes. I passed the neighbor again, this time closer. He stood near the edge of his yard, hands tucked into his coat pockets, staring at something in the distance. I cleared my throat and spoke, "Good evening." His head turned slightly, slow and deliberate, and he acknowledged me with a nod, still silent. His eyes were sharp, measuring. It was a gaze that seemed to peer into the very substance of thought, weighing intention, scanning for truths hidden beneath simple words. The feeling was unsettling, yet it drew me in. I found myself searching for clues in his expression, for hints of friendliness, hostility, or some other emotion I could understand. I lingered near the fence for a moment, unsure whether to continue walking or retreat to the safety of the cabin. Then I noticed a slight tremor in the fog, a subtle shift, as though the air itself had moved in response to his presence. It was an imperceptible motion, but my mind caught it and my skin prickled. He did not speak, did not gesture, only remained still, a sentinel among shadows. And then, just as I felt I could bear it no longer, he turned away, his movements smooth and controlled, disappearing into the fog that gathered along the road. The villagers I passed again whispered among themselves, their glances brief but loaded with significance. I caught the word watching again, faint and hurried, and felt the undercurrent of tension in the air. It was clear that the neighbor was not just reserved. He was a figure of concern, if not fear, in the quiet rhythms of the village. Their caution only made me more curious. Who was he? What had he done, or what did he know, that warranted such hushed attention? I returned to the cabin, the chill settling deeper into my bones, and looked out the window toward his home. The fog had thickened now, curling around the trees, muting the shapes of rooftops and fences. The neighbor was gone from view, but the sense of his presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing softly against the edges of perception. I could almost imagine his eyes on me, patient and deliberate, measuring the movement of my hands, the tilt of my head, the slightest shift in my expression. Inside, I lit a small lamp and moved through the cabin, placing books on shelves, setting down utensils, adjusting blankets. The familiar act of settling in brought a fragile comfort, yet the unease from the walk remained. There was something in the hush of the village, the fog over the river, the distant outlines of figures moving behind doors and behind trees, that suggested observation, calculation, and patience. I was an intruder, or perhaps an audience, in a story that had been unfolding long before my arrival. Night fell fully, and the village quieted, leaving only the low whisper of wind and the occasional rustle of leaves against the cabin walls. I could sense the neighbor's house across the road, dark and silent, yet alive with a presence that defied explanation. The fog drifted slowly across the yard, curling along the edges of the road and the river, carrying with it the faint, almost imperceptible impressions of movement. And in that stillness, I realized I was not alone, and perhaps had never truly been. I sat by the window, the lamp casting soft light across the cabin walls, and tried to understand what I had witnessed. The neighbor's silence, the hushed conversations, the subtle shifts in the fog, all of it pressed into my mind with quiet insistence. I did not feel threatened, not in a conventional sense, but the weight of awareness was tangible, a soft, persistent pressure that made me hyper-aware of every breath, every step, every rustle beyond the cabin walls. Hours passed in that quiet, the night stretching long and deliberate. The wind whispered against the roof, the trees shifted softly, and I felt the rhythms of the village, the presence of my neighbor, and the subtle insistence of eyes, seen or imagined, tracking my movements. The feeling was not frantic or urgent. It was calm, patient, and deliberate. It was the quiet that unsettles, the observation that lingers, the awareness that presses gently against the mind until thought itself feels exposed. Finally, I lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. The neighbor's house remained across the road, dark and silent, and the village seemed to settle into its quiet routines. Yet even in sleep, the impression of watching remained. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, letting the darkness fill my mind, knowing that the fog, the silence, and the patient gaze of the neighbor would continue to occupy my thoughts. They were a presence, subtle yet persistent, and I could feel their weight even behind closed lids. And in that quiet, I understood something I could not yet name. The village had its own rhythm, its own stories, and its own guardians. The neighbor, silent and watchful, was a part of it, and now so was I, however reluctantly. The first night had passed, Yet the sense of observation, patient and deliberate, would follow me through every shadow, every step, and every whispered moment in the days to come. Night had fallen fully by the time I stepped outside, the village quiet except for the soft creak of branches swaying in the wind and the distant murmur of the river beyond the trees. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke. I had been sitting inside the cabin, trying to convince myself that the strange tension of the day was nothing more than my imagination, that the reserved neighbor was simply cautious, and the villagers wary of strangers. But when I glanced across the road, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint glow flickering through the thin curtains of the neighbor's cabin. It was subtle at first, barely more than a hint of light behind the weathered glass panes. Then, after a few seconds, the glow shifted as though someone or something was moving a lamp from one window to another. My pulse quickened slightly, though I tried to steady it. Perhaps it was merely a reflection, a candle being moved, or even a lantern swaying in the wind. But something about the motion was deliberate, measured, and unnerving in its patience. I stepped closer to the edge of the yard, leaning slightly to peer around the corner of the fence. The flicker continued, occasional shadows dancing across the curtains. And then I heard it, the softest of voices, faint murmurs, almost drowned by the rustling of leaves. At first, I thought I imagined them, convinced myself that my mind, stretched thin by solitude and curiosity, was inventing sound where there was none. But the voices persisted, layered, quiet, and muffled, speaking in tones that carried both fear and urgency. I couldn't make out the words, though now and then a sharper sound slipped through, like a stifled cry or a small, sharp scream. I froze, my eyes locked on the cabin. No one appeared at the door, no shadow passed beneath the eaves, and yet the sounds continued, patient and insistent. The faint flicker of light from the windows created the illusion of movement inside, but the cabin itself remained still, silent in its wooden shell. I realized, with a growing sense of unease, that the presence inside might not follow the logic of the physical world. The fog had begun to gather again, curling low along the ground and weaving between the trees and fences. It softened the edges of the buildings, moving the world into gray shapes. The neighbor's cabin seemed to exist in the center of this gray sphere, lit from within but refusing to acknowledge the outside. My own shadow fell against the yard as I shifted my weight, and I wondered if it reached the windows, if the lights inside were reacting to me, or perhaps to something I could not yet understand. I backed slightly, my hand brushing against the rough wood of the fence. The murmurs became clearer, though still unintelligible. There was a cadence to them, rhythmic almost, like whispers exchanged in a language just beyond comprehension. I tried to imagine what could be happening inside. A family, friends, or something else entirely. The flickering lights suggested motion, presence, yet every logical explanation felt inadequate. My rational mind struggled against the creeping dread, pressing along the edges of perception. I considered calling out softly, a greeting meant to test the neighbor's response. But the thought of being heard, of disturbing whatever ritual or act was taking place, made my mouth dry. I remained still, my breath shallow, trying to measure the risk of visibility against my need to understand. And then, unexpectedly, a sound that was both louder and sharper than before, a cry muffled yet distinct, slicing through the night. I flinched, pressing myself against the fence, listening. The wind shifted, and for a moment the murmurs fell silent. Then the flickering resumed, more erratic now, dancing across multiple windows. I sensed movement, shadows that didn't belong to any object I could identify. My mind raced, imagining doors opening and closing, feet packing across wooden floors, figures moving in deliberate circles, always careful to remain unseen. The rhythm of sound and light suggested life, yet every instinct warned me that I could not trust appearances. I walked a few steps back, trying to put distance between myself and the neighbor's cabin, but the curiosity that had brought me here in the first place anchored me in place. I thought about the villagers' hushed words, the caution in their voices, the slight glances exchanged whenever the neighbor was mentioned. Perhaps they knew something I did not, some story of past events, of disappearances, of things that moved silently behind walls. The thought tightened the knot of unease in my chest. The murmurs shifted again, now mingling with small creaks, almost like footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, moving across floors in patterns that seemed too controlled to be accidental. I leaned slightly to peer through a gap in the fence, trying to glimpse the interior without exposing myself. The cabin remained shadowed, light flickering in strange pulses, creating shapes that suggested human presence yet denied it. The eyes of my imagination filled in gaps where reality remained stubbornly opaque. I realized that I had been standing there for an hour, or perhaps minutes. Time itself felt slowed, stretched by the oppressive weight of observation and uncertainty. Every flicker of light, every shift of shadow, every soft cry seemed to stretch across the space between reality and perception. I felt a subtle pull, like gravity but psychological, urging me to stay, to witness, to listen, even as my instincts screamed that distance would be safer. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the voices fell silent. The flickering ceased, leaving the cabin dark as though it had never been lit at all. I strained my ears, listening to the subtle hum of the village, the whisper of wind through trees, the soft rustle of leaves along the ground. My pulse slowed slightly, but the tension lingered, leaving a residual awareness that something unseen had moved in those rooms, had observed, had existed in a dimension parallel to my own. I retreated to the cabin, stepping lightly, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. Inside, the familiar smell of wood and dust greeted me, but the oppressive awareness from the outside clung to me. I lit a lamp, the soft glow casting long shadows across the walls, and tried to convince myself that the neighbor had merely been moving around inside, living his life in solitary routine. Yet the thought of muffled cries and flickering lights suggested otherwise, leaving a trace of doubt that refused to dissipate. Sitting by the window, I watched the road in both directions. The fog had thickened, curling low and hiding details, turning houses into shapes, fences into gray lines, and trees into columns of shadow. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps he was practicing some craft, some hobby that required quiet and careful light, perhaps even rehearsing scenes of his past, but the rational explanations felt hollow. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, and I sensed that the neighbor's cabin existed at the center of that pause. Hours passed. I listened to the wind, the distant call of nocturnal birds, the occasional rustle of branches, but the image of flickering lights, shadows moving, and the faint cries persisted in my mind. They were not vivid memories, but impressions, feelings, a subtle pressure on my perception that made even the quiet moments uncomfortable. Every shift of light from the cabin in the distance seemed to echo within my imagination, stirring questions I could not answer. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I lay down, but sleep came slowly. The faint images of flickering light and muffled voices danced behind my closed eyelids, weaving into dreams that were at once familiar and alien. I sensed presence, patient and deliberate, observing me as I tried to rest. The neighbor's cabin, dark and silent, remained at the edge of consciousness, a subtle locus of tension and awareness. Even in the dim safety of my own room, I felt that the events outside had left a mark, a lingering impression of observation, calculation, and quiet insistence. I realized that this was only the beginning. The first night had shown me glimpses of what lay behind the walls of that cabin, the faint hum of life, or something like life, moving in spaces I could not penetrate. The neighbor's presence, though silent and unseen, had revealed itself through the smallest details, flickers of light, muffled sounds, and the subtle insistence of something patient and deliberate. And as I drifted, half asleep, half aware, I understood that the observation would not end with night. It would follow, subtle and unrelenting, shaping perception, memory, and thought. The flickering lights, the muffled cries, the quiet movement, they were marks of presence, a gentle, persistent reminder that some stories do not reveal themselves fully, that some watchers exist just beyond the edge of vision, patient, careful, and eternal. The next morning, I woke to a fog so thick it felt almost solid, curling along the ground and threading through the trees. The village itself seemed to have been swallowed, leaving only the muted colors of roofs and fences, pale shapes drifting in white mist. I had spent the night replaying the flickers of light from the neighbor's cabin, the muffled voices, and those faint cries that had cut through the stillness like echoes of something I couldn't yet name. Sleep had come fitfully, every imagined sound magnified in the darkness, every shadow in my room stretching toward me with quiet menace. I dressed slowly, feeling the chill in the air seep into my bones. Something about the fog made the world feel suspended, timeless. I decided to explore the trails around the neighbor's cabin, hoping to understand the place a little better, hoping that the morning would bring clarity where night had brought only unease. My footsteps were soft against the damp earth, the leaves giving a quiet crunch beneath my shoes. Every step seemed amplified, every snapping twig startling in a way that made the hair on my neck rise. The trails were narrow, winding between trees so close together that sunlight, when it came, barely reached the forest floor. Moss clung to rocks and roots like a heavy green carpet, damp and soft. I noticed the occasional remnants of human presence, a broken fence post here, a rusted tin can there, a faded piece of cloth caught on a low branch. These small artifacts, ordinary in isolation, began to accumulate in my mind, forming a subtle narrative. Someone had been here before, moving through these woods, leaving traces behind. I followed the main trail, noting the way it twisted and doubled back on itself, how roots snagged shoes and branches brushed against my shoulders. The silence was pervasive, only interrupted by the occasional bird call or the whisper of the wind through needles and leaves. But as I moved deeper, I began to notice things that made my heart tight. A glove, half buried in the mud, stiffened by frost. A torn shoe, its leather cracked and soaked. These were small, seemingly insignificant items, yet their presence suggested absence. Someone once here, now gone. The fog shifted as I walked, curling in sudden swirls around my legs, and I felt as though it had a weight, pressing not only on the landscape but on my mind. It was impossible to tell whether the shapes in the mist were trees, rocks, or the shadows of something else. I kept my gaze low, scanning the ground, and that is when I saw it. The outline of a depression in the earth, roughly circular, partially filled with leaves and frozen soil. My stomach tightened. I knelt, brushing leaves aside, and realized that this was a grave, a small, unmarked one. There was another just beyond it, slightly larger, the earth heaped and uneven. I stood slowly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The forest, in its quiet and foggy isolation, held secrets I hadn't imagined. Half-buried graves, scattered personal belongings, and the eerie sense that someone had been here before me, leaving traces of lives interrupted. My pulse quickened, and yet a strange compulsion urged me forward. I had to see more, had to understand what had been hidden in these trails. I followed a narrower path that branched off from the main trail, the trees closing in around me, their trunks wet and dark. There were more signs of human presence. A scarf snagged on a low branch, frayed and frozen stiff. A child's shoe, tiny and forgotten. A piece of paper soaked and crumpled, half buried in mud. I picked it up carefully, letting it unfold in my hands. The writing was faint, almost illegible, but the few words I could make out spoke of fear, of someone hiding, of voices in the night. The handwriting trembled across the page, the letters uneven, desperate. A sudden rustle made me freeze. My heart beat rapidly and I held my breath. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, like someone or something moving through leaves beyond the trail. I strained my ears, but the fog seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the rustle of my own movement and the occasional distant caw of a bird. I told myself it was the wind, branches brushing against each other, animals waking in the woods. Yet the instinctive tightness in my chest told a different story, that this forest, these trails, were not entirely empty. I moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the ground for more traces. There were footprints, partial and fading, leading in no clear direction. Some were small, delicate, others larger, heavier. They disappeared and reappeared as though the earth itself were playing tricks on perception. I followed one set for a while, noting how it curved away from the main trail and into a grove where the fog was thickest. I felt the weight of the neighbor's cabin behind me, the village silent and distant, and the pressing sense that someone had watched these trails for years, waiting, observing, patient. The further I went, the more I realized the scale of what had been hidden. Shallow depressions, personal items scattered across the forest floor, and more half-buried graves, marked only by disturbed earth and the occasional stone placed without ceremony. Each discovery pressed against my mind, demanding attention, forcing me to acknowledge a truth I wasn't ready to face. These were lives erased, stories interrupted, evidence of people who had vanished without notice, leaving only fragments behind. I crouched beside one of the graves, brushing the frost from the mound. The soil beneath was hard, frozen, but I could see the imprint of what had been buried. It was small, almost childlike, though I could not be certain. I pressed my hands against the cold earth, imagining the fear, the quiet desperation, the unrecorded suffering. The thought made my stomach twist, and I felt an unfamiliar responsibility. The lives of those forgotten were now, in a sense, under my witness. As I moved deeper into the grove, the fog thickened further, obscuring all but the immediate surroundings. Shadows shifted in patterns that were difficult to interpret, and the sound of the wind became a low, murmuring whisper. I thought again of the neighbor's cabin, of the flickering lights and muffled voices from the night before. Perhaps these trails had always led to this darkness, this hidden record of absence, of watching, of patient presence. Perhaps he had known, and perhaps the villagers' whispered words were not caution but warning. I found another object, half buried in a clump of roots, a locket tarnished and frozen shut. I pried it open carefully, revealing a small photograph inside, its edges frayed, the faces faint but unmistakably human. I turned it over in my hands, feeling a chill that went deeper than the cold air. Someone had cared, loved, feared, perhaps even lost everything in these woods. And now I held a fragment of that story, a remnant of lives that had been claimed quietly, invisibly. I stepped back, letting the locket drop into my pocket. The fog shifted again, and I thought I saw movement in the distance, a shadow drifting between trees, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. My pulse thudded in my chest, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. There was no wind, no animal, nothing that could account for the subtle shape. Only the quiet, patient observation that seemed to pulse through the forest itself, pressing against my mind. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had no meaning in the fog-choked trails. Every step I took seemed to echo, every rustle seemed intentional, every shadow suggested a presence that I could not see. I realized then that the neighbor's cabin, the flickering lights, and the whispered voices were not isolated incidents. They were part of a network, a rhythm of the village and the forest, a persistent awareness that had watched over these trails for decades. I retraced my steps slowly, keeping my eyes on the faint outlines of trees and the low fog. The graves, the scattered belongings, and the subtle impressions of lives vanished, pressed against my memory, forming a narrative I could not ignore. Even as I approached the edge of the woods, the sense of being observed did not fade. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the careful patience of a presence that had existed long before I arrived and would remain long after I left. By the time I reached my cabin, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the familiar shapes of rooftops and fences. Yet the traces of the forest, the hidden trails, and the quiet history of absence remained, pressing against the edges of perception. I stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, breathing slowly, aware that I had glimpsed only a fraction of what lay hidden. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the locket still warm in my pocket. The images of half-buried graves, scattered belongings, and the faint shadows drifting between trees replayed behind my closed eyes. The neighbor's cabin, silent and dark across the road, felt closer than ever, as though he too had witnessed what I had seen, as though the village itself had been waiting for someone to acknowledge the trails of absence. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I realized something undeniable. The forest, the trails, the fog, and the distant lights of the cabin were all part of a quiet, deliberate system. It was patient, eternal, and observant. And now, in some small and subtle way, I was woven into it too. I woke that morning to a silence that felt almost unnatural, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and filled the spaces where sound should have been. Usually at this hour, the distant crowing of crows or the soft bark of a dog traveling through the village reached my ears, but today there was nothing, only a stillness that seemed to hang in the air like fog, heavy and waiting. The neighbor's cabin sat across the road as it always had, framed by the early morning light and the lingering haze of mist. Yet as I squinted through the thin veil, I felt something shift in me, a small, creeping sensation that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. There were no lights flickering, no faint movements behind the curtains. In fact, there was no evidence of life at all. The cabin, which had felt alive with hidden rhythms, now seemed frozen in an empty pause, as if it had been vacated in the dead of night. I walked across the yard, careful to step lightly over the frost-kissed grass. Each step felt loud, echoing against the oppressive stillness, and I kept glancing toward the neighbor's door. There was no sound, no movement. The faint traces of smoke from a chimney that had been there yesterday were gone, leaving only the smell of damp wood and cold stone. My stomach twisted, an instinctive reaction I could not name, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. I approached the cabin slowly, peering through the windows. Inside, the furniture remained as it always had. The small table in the corner, the rocking chair with its threadbare cushion, and the shelves lined with books. Everything seemed untouched, yet lifeless. I half expected to see him sitting there, reading or tending to some quiet chore, but there was nothing, only the absence of sound and life. It was as though the house itself had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only the faint echoes of the life that had once occupied it. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had gone to town early, or maybe he had left for a visit elsewhere. But the village had been silent when I walked past, no sight of him on the streets, no wagging dogs or children playing. The hush of the morning felt deliberate enough to make the ordinary implausible. And then the thought hit me with sudden clarity. He had vanished, and not in a way that could be explained with ordinary logic. I circled the cabin slowly, searching for signs of departure. The back door was locked, the windows firmly shut, and there were no tracks in the thin frost around the perimeter. I bent down, brushing the ground with my fingers, hopping to find a footprint, a mark, anything that could explain where he had gone. But there was nothing, only the faint impressions of earth and leaves that looked as though no one had disturbed them in days. And yet I remembered vividly the presence that had been there the night before, the flickering lights, the muffled cries. That presence felt alive still, though the man himself was gone. The realization unsettled me, a creeping awareness that I could not shake. The cabin wasn't simply empty. Something lingered inside and around it, an invisible weight that pressed against perception, that made the air feel thicker, heavier, harder to breathe. I could sense it in the subtle vibrations in the floor beneath my feet, in the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My rational mind argued that this was fear, imagination, but my instincts refused to accept the comfort of explanation. I stepped back and sat on the edge of the porch, letting the chill seep into my hands as I tried to collect my thoughts. The village remained silent, and the fog had begun to roll in again, curling between trees and fences, softening edges, muting reality. I could see shapes in the mist, fences, bushes, trees, but they were strange, elongated, almost fluid, as though the world had melted slightly and left only a semblance behind. I shivered, drawing my coat tighter around me, aware that I was observing a space that existed in two states at once, the physical and the unseen. Memories of the trails I had walked the day before returned unbidden. The half-buried graves, the personal belongings scattered along hidden paths, the locket in my pocket, all of it spoke of lives disrupted, of stories interrupted. And now the neighbor had vanished. It was impossible to separate these threads. The forest, the trails, the abandoned objects, and now the empty cabin across the road. They were connected by a single, persistent force, observation. Some presence that watched, that waited, that marked the rhythm of the place. I decided to look closer, peering through the curtains at the interior. The rocking chair swayed slightly, though there was no wind, no movement that could account for it. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was a trick of the shadows, the fog outside blending with the dim interior light. And yet the sensation remained. I was being watched, measured, and my awareness alone seemed to stir the air, to create subtle changes in the cabin's environment. I circled to the side door, trying it gently. Locked. No sound came from within, no whisper, no shuffle. But when I pressed my ear to the wood, I could feel a subtle vibration, almost like breathing, almost like a heartbeat. It was not human, or at least not entirely human. I pulled back, my hand trembling, my mind racing to rational explanations. Perhaps it was the structure settling, a reaction to cold. Perhaps my imagination had grown too keen, too alert to the tiniest anomaly. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something patient and deliberate. I walked around the cabin again, taking note of the shadows. Each window seemed to hold a different shape, a different hue of darkness, as though the interior itself were a space in flux. The floors might have creaked as someone moved within, but no one emerged. The front door remained closed, the steps unmarked. And yet I felt that the cabin had a presence of its own now, an awareness that stretched outward, brushing against my senses, insisting that I acknowledge it. The fog thickened further, obscuring the edges of the yard, the trees, the village beyond. I sensed figures just at the limit of sight, shadows that resolved into nothing when I focused on them. The neighbor had gone, yes, but something remained. A quiet, patient consciousness moving through space, aware of me, marking my presence, waiting for me to understand that absence was not emptiness. The cabin had become a vessel for something larger, something I could not yet define. I stepped back to the porch, watching, listening. The subtle creak of wood beneath the eaves, the faint shift of air in corners, the whisper of fog through the trees, all seemed amplified in the absence of the neighbor. I realized that this place had its own memory, its own rhythm. It remembered footsteps, cries, and lives disrupted. And now it had added me to its record, a quiet, persistent note in the ledger of unseen observation. The day passed in this manner, slow and oppressive. Shadows lengthened, fog thickened, and the sense of being observed never faded. I tried to leave the cabin's vicinity, but even at a distance, I felt the pull of that presence, subtle and insistent, drawing me back to the empty structure. It was as if the absence of the man had opened a space that needed filling, and I had become the one to occupy it, at least temporarily. By evening, the village remained hushed. I wandered back along familiar paths, noting the ordinary life continuing in other homes, in distant fields, but the silence around the neighbor's cabin was absolute. I returned there one last time, standing in the fading light, staring at the darkened windows. The feeling of eyes upon me persisted, patient and unyielding. I realized that this was no ordinary vacancy. Something lived here still, even without a body to inhabit it, something that had survived beyond the man, beyond the life that once moved through these rooms. I left the porch reluctantly, the fog curling low, winding between my legs like slow, liquid fingers. I walked back to my own cabin, each step weighted by the awareness that I had glimpsed only a fragment of a larger truth. The neighbor had vanished, yes, but the presence remained. It lingered in shadows, in the fog, in the subtle shifts of light and air. And I understood with a slow, undeniable clarity that the story of this place was not over. It could not be resolved. Some mysteries, patient and deliberate, exist to endure, to observe, to leave behind only echoes of what was once there. That night I lay awake, the memory of empty windows, subtle vibrations, and faint, impossible sounds pressing against my consciousness. Sleep came reluctantly, weaving dreams that seemed half recalled and half invented, shadows of events that may or may not have occurred. And when I awoke, I felt it still, the lingering presence, quiet but insistent, a ghostly measure of observation that had no form, no voice, yet unmistakably existed. The neighbor was gone. But what remained was more profound, more patient, and infinitely more unsettling. The road to the cabin was narrower than I remembered from the map, winding through pines that pressed close on either side. Their trunks were darkened with age, and the wind whispered through their needles with a soft, constant susurration that made me feel small, almost watched. I arrived at the clearing as the sun had just begun its slow descent, spilling golden light across the tips of the trees and catching the edges of the cabin's roof. The building had been vacated recently, or at least that was the impression I received from the thin layer of dust coating every horizontal surface. Stepping up to the front door, I noticed something immediately. The air around the cabin felt heavier, as if the space itself carried the memory of its last occupant. I pressed my hand to the doorknob and hesitated, feeling the faint vibration of the metal against the quiet hum of the forest. It was cold to the touch, and the door yielded with a small creak that startled me more than it should have. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Dust motes drifted lazily in the fading light from the windows, swirling like tiny, restless spirits. Every surface I touched left a trail, disturbing the settled layers of neglect. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, responding with an almost human-like protest, and I found myself pausing with each step, aware that the silence was absolute and that my presence felt amplified in it. Furniture was scattered in ways that suggested haste or carelessness. A chair tipped at an odd angle, a blanket half draped over a table. But something was off. The arrangement seemed almost purposeful, as if the objects were positioned to unsettle, to signal the intrusion of an observer even when none was present. I explored slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior. There were strange stains on the floor, splotches of a dark substance that seemed older than the dust surrounding them. I bent closer, trying to discern their origin, but could not. The patterns were too erratic to be footprints, too deliberate to be accidental spills. There was a rhythm to them, subtle but undeniable, like a message left for someone who could read between the lines. I could not read it, but I felt its intention. The place was alive with the residue of human attention, human obsession, human absence. Each room told a similar story. A cup left on the edge of a counter, a single boot in a corner, books stacked in unnatural symmetry. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye's shadows that did not correspond to the shapes of furniture, shifting subtly when I tried to look directly at them. I told myself it was exhaustion, the product of too many hours traveling and too many silent miles alone in the forest. But the sensation remained. Objects were not entirely still. A blanket would shift. A door would lean differently, as though the cabin was aware of my scrutiny and adjusted itself accordingly. I moved to the kitchen. The windows were smeared with condensation, and through the glass, the fading sunlight made the dust inside the cabin sparkle like tiny constellations. I thought about preparing a meal, making the space feel temporarily mine, but my hands froze over the cold counter. There was a sense of intrusion here, of trespassing into a private, secret world that had only recently been abandoned. The faint echo of footsteps seemed to linger from some earlier time, though I knew the place had been empty for at least a few days. I explored the bedrooms next. The beds were unmade, sheets tangled and slightly damp as if someone had left in a rush. Personal items were scattered, books with dog-eared pages, a scarf draped over a chair, a pair of spectacles perched on the edge of a nightstand. I picked up one of the books, noticing the handwriting in the margins, a careful, looping script. Notes about the weather, about the day's chores, almost mundane, yet something about them felt tense, deliberate. They hinted at vigilance, at an awareness that someone, or something, was always present, always watching. The most unsettling discovery was in the small study at the rear of the cabin. A desk held papers, carefully stacked, yet one of them had slid slightly, leaving the corner protruding. I reached to push it back in line and hesitated. The paper had changed, or perhaps it had moved while I was distracted elsewhere. My pulse quickened and I took a step back, telling myself it was my imagination, a trick of the dim light, a misremembered position. But a deep, primal part of me understood that the cabin had a rhythm, a memory of its last inhabitants, and it was responding, silently, deliberately, to my presence. There were no signs of struggle, no overt threats, nothing that could explain why the place carried such unease. Yet it did. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the wood, every glint of reflected light on a dusty surface felt charged, as though the air itself were alive with expectation. I began to feel a profound dislocation from time. The cabin seemed both recently inhabited and decades old simultaneously, as though I had stepped into a space that existed out of sync with the world outside. By mid-afternoon, the sun had begun its descent and the interior shadows deepened. I moved back to the main room, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing in from all sides. I caught a glimpse of movement. A chair shifted slightly when I wasn't looking. A book slid across the floor just a few inches. I felt my chest tighten, my awareness sharpening. My rational mind searched for explanation. Perhaps a draft, perhaps the settling of the house, perhaps some small animal that had found its way inside. Yet no sound accompanied the movement, no disturbance, no hint of an intruder, only the quiet assertion of presence. I sat down on the edge of a sofa, trying to collect my thoughts. Dust drifted in the slanting light, sparkling like microscopic fireflies. The stains on the floor, the slightly displaced objects, the odd arrangement of the furniture, it all suggested awareness. The cabin remembered. The cabin watched. And for the first time, I felt that I had become part of that memory, a note in a ledger that was far larger than myself, far older than the thin layer of dust coating every surface. Hours passed in this rhythm of observation. I moved from room to room, noting details I could scarcely describe. A shadow that lingered too long, a small object that appeared in a new location after I had left the room, the quiet whisper of air that carried no draft. My mind struggled to interpret the signs, and yet I could not dismiss them. Something about this place resisted comprehension, and that resistance pressed against me, soft but persistent, a quiet demand for acknowledgement. As the evening drew near, I lit a small lantern I had brought with me. The flickering light cast long shadows, stretching and bending across the walls, creating shapes that seemed almost sentient. I noticed a curtain had moved slightly, as if brushed by a passing hand, though the window was closed. The air smelled faintly of smoke and old wood, and my ears caught the tiniest creak of floorboards somewhere above me, in a room I had not yet explored. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself in reason. Yet every instinct warned me to remain vigilant. I left the cabin then, stepping into the cool evening air. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves. I looked back at the cabin, half expecting to see movement in the windows, a shadow packing, a figure watching. There was nothing, only the still outline of a building covered in dust and faint, strange stains. And yet I knew that the cabin was alive in ways that defied ordinary understanding. I had entered a space that carried memory, awareness, and now my own presence. I settled into a small clearing nearby, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. My mind churned with questions. What had the previous occupants left behind? What was it they had sensed, or known, or feared? And how long would the cabin remember me, my footsteps, my curiosity, my intrusion into its quiet, deliberate world? I shivered, feeling both the chill of the evening and the weight of the space I had dared to enter. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the cabin wrapped in shadows, dust, and secrets that I was only beginning to comprehend. I understood then with a slow, unyielding certainty that the cabin had a rhythm, a life of its own, and that life was patient. It would wait, it would observe, it would persist. And I had stepped into its story, whether I wanted to or not. After the long walk around the cabin, I returned inside as the light was fading, the interior now a deep amber from the lantern I carried. The air smelled heavier than before, a mixture of dust, wood, and something faintly metallic that made my stomach turn with unease. I felt the weight of the cabin pressing in on me, not just the roof overhead or the walls around me, but something older, something that remembered. I had left the door closed, yet the silence inside seemed thicker, as if it had absorbed the fading daylight in my footsteps and held them there. I moved slowly toward the study again. The desk called to me in a way I could not explain, as if it wanted me to discover what had been left behind, or perhaps what had been hidden on purpose. Papers lay stacked neatly, some yellowed with age, others crumbling at the edges. Among them, I found old newspapers, the corners folded as if someone had studied them obsessively. The headlines were sharp, concise, and chilling. Reports of disappearances, of families vanishing from the surrounding forests, of local authorities baffled and stymied. Each article seemed to link the cabin to a series of crimes I had never heard about, though the names and dates suggested that this had been ongoing for decades. I picked up a newspaper from the mid-1980s. The edges were brittle, and the smell of old ink and decaying paper filled my nose. The report told of a man who had rented the cabin during the winter, only to be found missing after a week, his belongings untouched, his car abandoned on the narrow mountain road. The story was quiet in print, clinical, as though the reporters had struggled to remain objective. Yet as I read, a cold knot of fear settled in my stomach. The cabin seemed to respond to my discovery, the shadows stretching longer, settling in corners where I hadn't noticed them before. Among the papers were handwritten notes, yellowed scraps filled with looping cursive that had been left in margins or tucked between pages. Some contained warnings. They watch from outside even when unseen. Do not follow the footsteps. The walls remember. Others were fragments of thought, seemingly incoherent at first, but each carried a weight of urgency, a quiet terror that suggested the writer had been very aware of something beyond the ordinary. I traced the words with my fingers, feeling the indentations in the paper as if they were still alive, as if the fear had been pressed into the sheets and lingered there decades later. I set the papers aside and found a small journal, leather-bound, its clasp slightly rusted but intact. The cover was unremarkable, but when I opened it, I felt that same pressing unease settle over me. The entries were dated consecutively over several months. At first, they read like the diary of someone alone in the wilderness, noting weather, chores, and mundane details of life in the cabin. Then, gradually, the entries took a darker turn. The writer began to describe shadows moving where there should be none, soft noises at night that could not be explained, and a constant sense of being watched, even in the bright daylight. I read through a particularly disturbing entry, written late one February evening. I see them again, always at the edge of the trees. They do not move like animals, but like reflections of movement that shouldn't exist. I tried to leave today, but the car would not start. I cannot tell if it is fear or the forest itself that traps me here. I feel them behind the walls. I feel them in the dust. I am not alone. I set the journal down, my fingers trembling slightly. The cabin had always felt alive, but now it seemed that the life it held was not my own, that it belonged to those who had come before, those who had vanished without explanation. The weight of their presence pressed down, subtle but unyielding. I could almost hear the faint scraping of floorboards from rooms I had not yet entered. I told myself it was the old wood, expanding and contracting with the cold evening air. But deep inside, I knew it was more than that. Curiosity pushed me further. I gathered more papers and notes, trying to piece together the stories of the previous tenants. There was a pattern. Each had arrived, each had documented something, often small, easily dismissed at first. Then each had disappeared, leaving behind only traces of their existence. Notes warned of unseen watchers, of voices in the shadows, of doors that moved when unobserved. I shivered as I read, realizing that the cabin itself seemed to be a witness to every act, a vessel carrying memory through time. I found one particularly unsettling note, scribbled hastily on a torn piece of notebook paper. Do not trust the reflection. They know your name. They wait for the candle to go out. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the chill seep into my bones. The candle I had lit earlier flickered softly, casting elongated shadows across the walls. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, something that vanished when I turned my head. I shook my head, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I was alone. I was certain of it, yet the cabin insisted otherwise. The stories in the newspapers and notes seemed to unfold in real time as I read them. I could almost imagine the previous tenants moving through the rooms, performing their daily tasks, unaware that the cabin itself held them in some quiet, eternal record. It was as if by reading I had awakened something, drawn it closer, invited it to notice me. Each line, each fragment, carried a sense of urgency, a warning that I could not fully comprehend but felt in the pit of my stomach. I traced the path of one missing tenant, noting the small, often mundane details of their final days. Footsteps recorded in the dust, objects slightly displaced, windows left open despite the cold. The cabin's memory seemed to hold these moments in a perfect loop, accessible only to those who dared to notice, to read, to watch. I realized then that the place did not just witness, it participated. It guided, it suggested, and it waited. By the time the sun had fully set, the interior was cloaked in shadow. The lantern I had carried cast long, wavering shapes, and I felt every surface of the cabin press against me. I could hear the faint scratching of some small animal, or was it something else? In the walls. I forced myself to focus on the papers, to read the last few lines of the journal before I put it aside. One entry stood out, almost at the end. I hear them speaking in the wind. They know my name now. They will not let me leave. I can feel the eyes in the floorboards, the hands in the dust. Perhaps I should have left when I had the chance. Perhaps it is already too late. I shivered again, my body reacting to the weight of history pressing down from the past. The cabin seemed to settle, exhaling a quiet, deliberate sound that felt almost like a sigh. I understood that the stories I had uncovered were not just tales of the past. They were ongoing, continuous. By stepping inside, by reading, by noticing, I had become part of them. I moved to the window and peered into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed quiet, almost expectant. I could feel the cabin's memory pressing outward, reaching beyond the walls, beyond the floorboards, beyond the layer of dust. The shadows in the corners seemed to linger a fraction longer, and the soft creak of a floorboard echoed in a way that suggested someone, or something, was packing just beyond the light. I settled back into the chair, trying to collect my thoughts. The papers, the notes. The old newspapers, they had opened a window to the cabin's secret life, a life that was patient, observing, and subtly demanding acknowledgement. I could not ignore what I had read. I could not leave these fragments unexamined. And yet, a part of me wanted desperately to shut the journal, to walk away, to pretend that the cabin was nothing more than a forgotten relic, empty and harmless. But I knew that it was not. As darkness fully claimed the room, I felt the quiet pressure of time suspended. The cabin was alive with memory, aware of my presence, and patient. I had uncovered the warnings, the stories, the fragments of lives lived and lost within these walls, and I understood with a creeping certainty that my own story had now begun to intertwine with theirs. The forest outside whispered in the wind. Dust settled on the papers. Shadows stretched and recoiled. And somewhere deep inside the cabin, in the quiet spaces between floorboards and ceiling beams, the memory of the past tenant stirred, waiting, watching, acknowledging me. I could feel it in every shiver, every breath, every pause of my heartbeat. The cabin was alive. The warnings had been forgotten, but not by me, not anymore. The morning after poring over the newspapers, notes, and journals, I woke to an unfamiliar weight in the room. I can't explain it clearly, like the air itself had become denser, watching me as I moved through the cabin. The sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, yet the shadows seemed darker somehow, stretching into corners that should have been bright. I had slept fitfully, turning over each memory of the previous tenants like a puzzle I could not solve, feeling the presence of something just beyond my sight, lingering near the edges of perception. I made my way through the cabin quietly, careful not to disturb anything. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and for a moment I imagined it was a subtle warning, a soft announcement that I was not alone. Yet the cabin was quiet otherwise, still, as if holding its breath. Each room I passed seemed to respond to me, the objects slightly shifting when I wasn't looking directly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make me pause and glance twice. A chair, once pushed neatly against a table, now angled slightly as if someone had just stood from it. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination, that the weight of the stories I had read had simply made me hyper-aware. By mid-morning, the unease had thickened into something almost tangible. I gathered the papers and journals I had been reading, stacking them carefully on the desk. Each sheet seemed to hum softly with the memory it contained, whispers of lives long gone pressed into the fibers, vibrating faintly beneath my fingers. I felt a hesitation, a sudden reluctance to disturb them further, as though touching the papers directly invoked the presence that lingered in the cabin. I realized with a creeping certainty that these walls were not passive. They had absorbed the lives, the fears, the disappearances of everyone who had stayed here, and now they were aware of me. I decided to leave, but even that simple thought came with hesitation. The door to the outside, once unremarkable, now seemed like a threshold I could not cross without acknowledgement. The cabin seemed to hold me in place, the air itself whispering, pressing softly against my chest as I reached for the knob. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a subtle vibration in the room that made me step back. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. This was reality, or at least, a version of reality I could no longer fully trust. I paused in the hallway, listening. At first, there was nothing but the gentle creak of old wood, the faint whisper of wind through the cracks in the cabin. Then I thought I heard it, a whisper so soft it might have been my own mind. Yet it was distinct, patterned almost, like words half-formed but deliberately obscured. I froze, straining to catch the syllables, to understand the cadence. There was nothing I could decipher, but the tone carried an unmistakable urgency. It was as if the cabin itself were speaking, warning me, reminding me that the story of this place did not end with me. I gathered my bag, the essentials I had brought with me, and hesitated by the door. For a moment, the temptation to leave without touching anything else nearly overcame me, but curiosity anchored me in place. I stepped into the living room one last time, scanning the furniture, the desk, the shelves. Dust motes floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts, and in the corner I thought I saw a shadow detach itself from the wall and linger in a way that did not belong. My pulse quickened, but I kept my breath slow and deliberate. I told myself it was my imagination. I needed it to be. I moved to the kitchen and noticed the table. A journal lay open there as if someone had left it mid-sentence. I didn't recognize the handwriting immediately. The words were scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic style, describing things I didn't understand at first. The sentences spoke of watching eyes, of footsteps in the dark, of doors that opened when no one was present. It was familiar in tone, echoing the warnings I had read in the other journals. My stomach tightened. Whoever had written this, whoever had passed through this place before me, had been aware of the same things I now felt, and they had not left willingly. A soft tap at the window made me start. I turned quickly, expecting the wind or a branch, but saw nothing. Just the usual dust, the streaked glass, the pale light of the morning filtering through. Yet the tap repeated, faint and deliberate. I could no longer convince myself it was just coincidence. I stepped back slowly, my eyes scanning the room, the hallway, the corners where shadows pooled unnaturally. My mind raced with every story I had uncovered. I thought of the tenants who had vanished, the warnings left behind in ink and paper. I realized that leaving would not be simple. The cabin did not allow easy departures. It held memories, and in holding them, it held me. I took a step toward the door and froze. The floorboards beneath my feet seemed to shiver, a vibration that I felt more than heard. A whisper followed, soft, urgent, and low, a breath of sound that carried meaning I could not grasp. I felt my heart pound, each beat heavy with anticipation and dread. I told myself to move, to step outside, but the air seemed thicker now, resisting my motion. I could feel eyes on me, unseen yet undeniably present, from walls, corners, the spaces beneath the furniture. The cabin had remembered me, and in remembering, it had awakened something. Finally, I gripped the doorknob firmly and turned it. The door swung open smoothly, revealing the bright morning beyond, the forest muted in light and color by the soft haze that hung over it. I stepped out cautiously, the ground cold beneath my shoes, the air crisp yet heavy. I could still feel the weight of the cabin behind me, pressing softly, insistently. The whispers did not end. They followed me just beyond the threshold, brushing against my mind like cold fingers. I walked quickly, but the sound of the cabin seemed to reach me from every angle, the wind carrying hints of voice, of movement, of presence. I kept moving through the thin trail leading away from the cabin, past the trees that now seemed taller, darker, more watchful. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken, yet I did not dare stop. The cabin's memory clung to me, an invisible tether I could feel stretching from the door I had left behind. It was patient. It was enduring. It would wait for the next visitor, and for the next, and for all who would not see what it truly held. As I finally reached the road, the cabin faded into the morning haze behind me, yet I could not shake the feeling that it remained aware of me, marking me, nodding that I had been here. I told myself that it was over, that I had escaped the physical structure. But deep down, I understood that the cabin's history, its stories, and the echoes of the past tenants would continue, perhaps forever. I could feel it in my chest, in the lingering weight behind my eyes, in the whisper of the wind that carried something not entirely human. Driving away the road winding through dense forest, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin seemed smaller, distant, harmless even. Yet I knew better. It did not care about distance. It cared about memory. It cared about the ones who noticed, who read, who recognized its quiet, patient power. And I had. By the time I reached the nearest town, the whispers had faded from my ears, but not from my mind. I could still picture the shadows stretching across the walls, the faint scratching of floorboards, the soft, deliberate tapping at the windows. I could still feel the presence of unseen eyes tracking me, observing me, recording me. I realized that the cabin's story was not mine alone. It was ongoing, eternal in its quiet persistence. And perhaps in time, someone else would come and I would become part of its memory, another whisper among the walls. I tried to speak of what I had felt, of what I had discovered, but the words seemed inadequate. Friends and strangers alike would have dismissed me, called it imagination, stress, or fatigue. I knew it was more than that. I had experienced it. I had felt it, weighed it, and carried it away with me. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. And in the quiet moments when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. The faintest brush of whispering, the echo of floorboards that are not mine, the sensation of eyes tracing me from places that no longer exist. The cabin's history continues, patient, silent, and unyielding. And I know that one day, perhaps sooner than I think, it will reach out again. For now, I carry the memory, and the memory carries me. I left the cabin behind, but the cabin never left me.